It began not on the battlefield, but in a room thick with cigarette smoke, damp wool, and the quiet pressure of decisions that could not wait. Outside, winter tightened its grip on Europe. Snow piled along roads. Engines struggled in the cold. Soldiers dug deeper into frozen ground. Inside Allied headquarters, maps lay spread across long tables, their edges curled, their surfaces scarred by countless pencil marks and coffee stains. Arrows pointed east, arrows pointed north. And in the center of it all sat a problem no one had expected to face so suddenly: the German breakthrough in the Ardennes. For George S. Patton, the moment did not feel like surprise. It felt like confirmation. He had been waiting for something like this, not out of hope, but out of instinct. War, in his mind, did not end quietly. It lashed out. It gambled. It clawed for one last chance. And now, as reports filtered in of American units being overrun, roads jammed with retreat, and a bulge forming in the Allied line, Patton understood immediately what it meant. The front had been bent, not broken. And, if it could be struck quickly, it could be sealed shut. The challenge was staggering. Patton's Third Army was facing east, driving hard toward Germany. Its supply lines stretched long and fragile. Roads were already strained by winter. Units were scattered across miles of territory. Turning an entire army in winter, not a division, not a corps, but an army, seemed impossible. Conventional wisdom said it would take weeks. Patton intended to do it in days. Long before the Ardennes attack began, Patton had done something unusual. Quietly, almost obsessively, he had prepared for a crisis no one else believed would come. His staff had drafted contingency plans for turning north, south, or west at a moment's notice. Fuel consumption was calculated, routes were studied, units were trained to move fast, even in poor weather. What seemed like paranoia at the time now became foresight. When the call came, there was no hesitation. Orders went out across frozen roads and crackling radio lines. Units halted their eastward push, columns pivoted, tanks reversed direction. Trucks loaded and reloaded in the dark. Staff officers worked through the night, redrawing routes, recalculating timelines, solving problems that changed by the hour. Winter fought them every step of the way. Snow-clogged mountain passes, ice turned roads into traps, engines froze, fuel burned faster than expected, traffic jams stretched for miles. And yet the movement continued. Soldiers marched north through the wind that cut like knives. Drivers navigated blacked-out roads guided only by faint headlights and instinct. Engineers cleared routes while shells fell nearby. Supply units raced to keep pace, knowing that speed meant survival, not just for Patton's army, but for the men trapped around Bastogne. The gamble was not just about movement, it was about timing. Every hour mattered. Every delay risked disaster. If Patton arrived too late, the encircled units might collapse. If he arrived piecemeal, his own forces could be shattered. Patton drove his commanders hard. Rest was secondary. Precision was everything. Orders were blunt, urgent, unforgiving. But beneath the harsh exterior was clarity. Patton knew exactly what he wanted: to strike north with force, to hit the enemy's flank, to relieve pressure where it was greatest, and to do it before the German offensive could stabilize. As the Third Army rolled north, the weather finally began to break. Clouds thinned, snow gave way to bitter cold and clearer skies. The roads opened just enough, and when Patton's lead element slammed into German positions south of Bastogne, the effect was immediate. The Germans had not expected it. They were stretched thin, focused westward, unprepared for a sudden counterstroke from the south. Patton's attack did not end the Ardennes battle overnight, but it changed its direction permanently. Pressure shifted. German momentum slowed. Bastogne's defenders felt the difference almost immediately. The relief corridor narrowed, then opened. The siege began to crack. What Patton accomplished was not magic. It was preparation meeting opportunity, planning meeting urgency, movement meeting decision. Turning an army in winter is one thing. Turning it fast enough to matter is another. The northward pivot of the Third Army became one of the defining moments of the Battle of the Bulge. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was decisive. It showed how anticipation can outpace surprise, how logistics can decide battles as surely as gunfire, how speed, when paired with preparation, can reshape an entire front. Tonight, we return to that moment, to the maps spread across tables, to the engines restarting in the dark, to the roads winding north through snow and uncertainty, to the decision that changed the fate of thousands. Before we continue deeper into this story, I want to ask you something calm and personal. Where in the world are you listening from right now, and what hour has settled around you? And if these long, reflective journeys through history help your thoughts slow, your breathing settle, or your mind drift toward rest, consider subscribing. December 15th, 1944, Luxembourg City. Inside a commandeered stone building that served as Third Army headquarters, Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. stood over a map table, his ivory-handled revolvers gleaming at his hips. Red grease pencil marks stabbed eastward across the paper like arrows aimed at the heart of Germany. His staff officers watched as he traced routes through the Siegfried Line, the massive German fortification system that had held up Allied advances for weeks. "We'll be across the Saar by Christmas," Patton announced, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a man who had never accepted the concept of defensive warfare. Outside, the winter rain hammered against medieval cobblestones, turning the ancient streets into rivers of freezing mud. None of the men in that room, studying routes that pointed relentlessly east, could have imagined that in 72 hours their entire army would execute a 90-degree turn and race north into what would become the most desperate battle of the Western European campaign. The Third Army had earned its aggressive reputation through 6 months of nearly continuous offensive operations. Since breaking out of Normandy in August, Patton's forces had driven across France with a speed that shocked both allies and enemies. 250,000 men now occupied a front stretching 75 miles along the German border. The 12th Corps was hammering at the fortified city of Saar-Lauterin. The 20th Corps had finally wrestled the ancient fortress of Metz into submission after weeks of brutal urban combat. Artillery thundered daily as American forces tested the concrete and steel of Hitler's Western Wall. Supply lines stretched back hundreds of miles to the Normandy beaches, a logistical nightmare that somehow kept functioning through sheer determination and improvisation. For the soldiers of Third Army, the war had a rhythm now, a grinding forward momentum that felt unstoppable despite the mud, the cold, and the German resistance that stiffened with every mile closer to the fatherland. December 16th dawned cold and miserable across the front. In rest areas behind the lines, men who had been pulled back for a few days of recovery wrote letters home with numb fingers. A private from Ohio told his mother they would be in Germany by Christmas. A tank commander from Texas sketched the outline of the Siegfried Line in his journal, adding notes about the upcoming offensive. Morning reports filtered up through battalion, regiment, and division headquarters with the usual litany of minor incidents. A patrol skirmish here, artillery exchange there, nothing to suggest this day would be different from any other. At division headquarters, intelligence officers filed reports about limited German activity to their front. The enemy seemed quiet, almost passive, beaten down by months of retreat and the overwhelming material superiority of the Allied forces. It was the kind of calm that in retrospect would seem almost sinister, but at the time simply felt like the exhausted pause of an enemy nearing collapse. Then the northern horizon began to flicker with light. At 10:30 in the morning, confused radio reports started arriving from 8th Corps, stationed in the Ardennes sector to the north. Local counterattacks, the initial reports suggested. Strong German patrol activity, nothing that seemed to require immediate attention from forces committed to their own offensive operations. Patton was at lunch when his chief of staff interrupted with a phone call from Omar Bradley's headquarters. The general's expression shifted from irritation at being disturbed to focused intensity as he listened. "How many divisions?" he asked quietly. The answer made him set down his fork. "I'll call back in 30 minutes, he said, already moving toward the map room. By evening, the scale of what was happening to the north had become impossible to ignore. An entire German army group had materialized out of the winter fog and was tearing through American positions with a violence that seemed to belong to an earlier, more desperate phase of the war. The scene inside Third Army headquarters that night marked the beginning of a transformation that would be studied by military officers for generations. Maps of the Saar offensive were rolled up and stored. New maps appeared, showing terrain to the north that most of the staff had not considered operationally relevant for months. The Ardennes, a sector held by green divisions resting after combat or waiting for their first taste of battle. 75 to 100 miles separated Third Army's current positions from a road junction most Americans had never heard of, Bastogne. Staff officers began receiving strange orders to pull files from safes, documents that bore code names like nickel, tin, and copper. These were contingency plans, scenarios that Patton had ordered prepared, despite having no official reason to do so. As midnight approached, the headquarters transformed into a hive of controlled chaos. Men working under dim lights to calculate movement tables for an operation that officially did not yet exist. The soldiers on the line knew nothing of these preparations. For them, December 16th ended much as it had begun, with cold rations and the prospect of attacking east in the morning. Company commanders received unexpected orders to hold positions and await further instructions. Battalion motor pools got alerts to prepare for movement, but without destinations. Ammunition that had been pre-positioned for the SAR offensive was quietly held in place rather than distributed forward. To the men in foxholes and tank crews making final checks on their vehicles, these seemed like the normal inefficiencies of Army bureaucracy, the kind of confusion that had become familiar background noise to military life. None of them understood that they were experiencing the first hours of one of the most dramatic operational pivots in modern military history. The weather continued to deteriorate as night fell. Temperatures dropped below freezing. The rain that had plagued the front for weeks transformed into freezing drizzle that coated every surface with a layer of ice. Roads that were already difficult became treacherous skating rinks. Vehicle movement slowed to a crawl. The cloud ceiling dropped to 200 feet, grounding the tactical aircraft that had become such a crucial part of American offensive operations. It was perfect weather for the Germans, and terrible weather for any force that needed to move quickly across country. In his quarters, Patton reviewed the reports from the north with growing concern. 2 regiments of the 106th Division were already cut off. The 28th Division's positions were crumbling. German armor was pushing deeper into American lines with each passing hour. The question forming in his mind was not whether Third Army would have to respond, but whether they could respond quickly enough to matter. Distance and terrain dominated the calculations being made that night. From the current Third Army positions to Bastogne measured roughly 100 miles by the available roads. Those roads were already clogged with supply convoys supporting the current offensive, military police directing traffic, refugees fleeing the German advance, and scattered units retreating in disorder from the breakthrough. Moving an entire corps that distance would be complicated under ideal conditions. Moving it in winter, on icy roads, through friendly forces in retreat, while maintaining combat effectiveness for immediate offensive operations upon arrival, approached the impossible. Standard Army doctrine suggested such a movement would require 2 weeks of planning and preparation. Intelligence estimates indicated Bastogne might not hold for 2 days. The mathematics of time, distance, and military capability were converging toward a problem that seemed to have no solution. Yet in staff sections throughout Third Army headquarters, officers were discovering that the impossible might be merely improbable. The contingency plans Patton had ordered prepared were more than theoretical exercises. They contained detailed movement tables, route assignments, assembly areas, and logistics calculations. Some officers had thought their commander paranoid when he ordered these plans developed. Others had seen it as Patton's ego, preparing for a dramatic role that would never be needed. Now those same documents were being pulled from safes and updated with current unit positions and road conditions. The work of days was being compressed into hours. By the time most soldiers bedded down for a few hours of cold sleep on December 16th, their commanders were already studying orders for a mission that would require them to disengage from their current offensive, turn 90 degrees, march 100 miles in winter conditions, and immediately attack a German force whose size and disposition remained largely unknown. The feast was over. The Third Army had been preparing to devour the Siegfried Line, to drive east into the industrial heart of Germany, to claim the glory of being first across the Rhine. Now all those plans were being set aside for a desperate rescue mission into the frozen forests of the Ardennes. For Patton, a general who lived for aggressive offensive warfare, the pivot north represented a professional opportunity, a chance to demonstrate that American forces could match the operational flexibility that German commanders had displayed in Poland and France. For his soldiers, most of whom would not understand the scale of what was being asked of them until they were already moving, December 16th marked the end of one campaign and the beginning of something far more desperate. The storm had arrived. The question now was whether Third Army could reach the breaking point before the breaking point reached Bastogne. 5:30 in the morning, December 16, 1944. The German-Belgian border. Darkness still covered the Ardennes forest when the eastern horizon erupted in light. 1,600 artillery pieces, secretly concentrated over weeks of careful preparation, opened fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front. The barrage was so intense that soldiers 20 miles away felt the ground shake. Searchlights positioned behind German lines reflected off the low cloud cover, creating an artificial moonlight that turned the winter landscape into a surreal dreamscape of shadow and illumination. American positions that had been quiet sectors, places where green divisions trained and exhausted divisions rested, transformed into chaos in minutes. The storm that Patton's staff had been tracking through fragmentary reports was now fully unleashed, and its scale exceeded anything Allied intelligence had considered possible. The soldiers of 8th Corps had no context for understanding what was hitting them. The 106th Infantry Division had arrived in the Ardennes just 5 days earlier, its men fresh from the United States, most having never heard a shot fired in anger. Their positions stretched across 27 miles of front, nearly 3 times the frontage doctrine recommended for a division in defensive positions. When the German artillery fell silent after 30 minutes and the first gray-clad infantry emerged from the fog, young American soldiers found themselves facing an enemy who fought with the skill and aggression of veterans. These were not the demoralized, understrength units that intelligence briefings had described. These were fresh divisions, some pulled from the Eastern Front, others rebuilt with fanatical SS volunteers, all committed to an offensive that Hitler had personally ordered, with the goal of splitting the Allied armies and capturing the port of Antwerp. The Americans fought with courage born of desperation, but courage alone could not compensate for experience, firepower, and numerical superiority. By mid-morning, the scope of the German offensive began clarifying through the fog of confused reports reaching higher headquarters. 3 German armies totaling more than 200,000 men had attacked simultaneously. 600 tanks, including the massive Tiger and Panther models that could destroy American Shermans at ranges where the American tanks could not effectively respond, were pushing through the broken American lines. The 6th SS Panzer Army struck in the north, targeting the road network that fed American logistics. The 5th Panzer Army drove toward the center, aiming for the crucial road junction at Bastogne. The 7th Army protected the southern flank, screening the main effort from interference. The operation represented the largest German offensive in the West since 1940, a concentration of force that Allied intelligence had deemed impossible, given Germany's strained resources and the pressure from Soviet offensives in the East. The weather proved to be Germany's most valuable ally. Clouds and fog that had settled over the Ardennes on December 15th showed no signs of lifting. American tactical air power, which had achieved almost complete dominance over the battlefield in recent months, was grounded. The fighter bombers that routinely destroyed German tanks and troop concentrations could not even take off in the thick soup that reduced visibility to a few hundred yards. German columns moved in daylight with impunity, advancing along roads that should have been killing grounds if American aircraft could reach them. The meteorological advantage had been carefully calculated by German planners who had studied weather patterns going back decades. They had gambled on a period of poor flying weather and won. For American ground forces accustomed to calling in airstrikes whenever the situation became difficult, the absence of that support was psychologically devastating as well as tactically crippling. The 106th Division's situation deteriorated from serious to catastrophic within hours. 2 entire regiments, more than 7,000 men, found themselves surrounded on the Schnee Eifel, a ridge that had seemed like good defensive terrain but had become a trap once German forces pushed past on either side. Radio calls for permission to withdraw went unanswered as higher headquarters struggled to understand the overall situation. By nightfall, on the 16th, these regiments were cut off completely, their fate sealed by decisions made in confusion and the speed of the German advance. To the south, the 28th Infantry Division, which had been savaged in the Hürtgen forest and sent to the Ardennes to rebuild, found itself fighting for survival as German armor punched through its thinly held positions. The division commander abandoned his headquarters in Wiltz as German tanks approached, staff officers burning classified documents, while small arms fire echoed through the medieval town. The road network of the Ardennes became the key terrain that would determine the battle's outcome. This was not tank country in the traditional sense, not the open plains where armor could maneuver freely. The Ardennes was a region of steep hills, dense forests, and narrow roads that wound through villages built centuries before anyone imagined mechanized warfare. Whoever controlled the roads controlled movement, and movement meant the ability to bring force to bear at decisive points. 7 major roads converged at Bastogne, a market town of 4,000 people that most American soldiers could not have located on a map before December 16th. German planners understood that Bastogne represented a bottleneck. Capture it, and the German advance could fan out west toward the Meuse River. Fail to capture it, and traffic jams would strangle the offensive as surely as American resistance. By December 17th, German units were racing toward Bastogne from 3 directions, their advance faster than Allied commanders had believed possible. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, the morning briefing on December 17th painted a picture that shocked even experienced staff officers. The red marks showing German penetrations stretched 20 to 30 miles beyond the initial front lines. Entire American units had disappeared from the map, their status unknown. The German offensive threatened to create a bulge 60 miles deep and 80 miles wide, splitting the American 1st and 3rd Armies, potentially cutting off and destroying multiple divisions. Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, looked at the map and made a decision that would define his leadership. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster, he told his staff. The words were brave, but the reality was sobering. American forces in the Ardennes were outnumbered, outgunned, and in danger of being outmaneuvered. Reinforcements were needed immediately, but where would they come from? The intelligence failure that allowed the German offensive to achieve complete surprise would be analyzed and debated for decades. Warnings had existed. German radio traffic had increased. Railway movements had been detected. Prisoner interrogations had mentioned rumors of a coming offensive. But the cumulative weight of evidence suggesting Germany was incapable of a major offensive had buried these signals in noise. Allied intelligence estimated Germany could field perhaps a dozen under-strength divisions for defensive operations in the West. The idea that Hitler could scrape together the resources for a major offensive involving 28 divisions seemed to defy logic. American commanders had convinced themselves that the enemy was beaten, that the war was entering its final phase, that the only question was how quickly Germany would collapse. The Germans exploited this overconfidence perfectly, achieving the kind of operational surprise that professional armies dream of and rarely achieve. For the American soldiers fighting in the Ardennes, the failure of intelligence was less important than the immediate reality of German tanks and infantry pushing them back through villages and forests they had thought secure. Small unit actions of desperate courage bought time but could not stop the German momentum. A company of combat engineers at Malmedy held a crossroads for 6 hours before being overrun. Tank destroyers from the 7th Armored Division established blocking positions and knocked out German tanks at point-blank range before withdrawing under pressure. Everywhere along the front, American units were learning that their enemy was not the demoralized rabble they had expected, but veteran soldiers fighting with skill and determination that matched anything seen earlier in the war. The psychological shock of this discovery, combined with the physical shock of artillery, armor, and infantry assault, created a crisis of confidence that rippled through the American command structure. As December 17th ended, the situation had clarified into a terrible simplicity. The Germans had achieved a breakthrough on a scale not seen in the West since 1940. American forces were retreating in disorder across much of the front. Bastogne was threatened from 3 directions, and its capture seemed inevitable within days. The weather showed no signs of improving, keeping Allied air power grounded. The only question was whether the German offensive could be contained before it reached the Meuse River, 40 miles beyond Bastogne, where bridges would allow German armor to break out into open country and threaten the entire Allied logistical system. Into this crisis would step forces that were already engaged in offensive operations of their own, armies that would have to pivot from attack to counterattack, from east to north, from planning offensive operations to executing a desperate relief mission against an enemy who had seized the initiative and the momentum. The ghost divisions that had materialized from the fog had created a crisis that would test American operational flexibility in ways it had never been tested before. December 19th, 1944. A cold stone room in French barracks at Verdun. the city where France and Germany had bled each other white 28 years earlier. Steam from breath hung visible in the air. Allied commanders filed in wearing heavy coats, their faces showing the strain of 3 days spent trying to contain a disaster that continued to expand with each morning's intelligence briefing. Dwight Eisenhower had called this emergency conference with specific instructions: no defeatism, no excuses, and no discussion of retreat. The room held the men who commanded Allied forces in Western Europe. Omar Bradley, commander of 12th Army Group, looking haggard after days of watching his front dissolve. Jacob Devers, whose 6th Army Group to the south might have to contract to free up reserves. Courtney Hodges of 1st Army, whose forces had taken the brunt of the German assault. And George Patton, whose 3rd Army was still engaged in offensive operations 75 miles south of the crisis. The meeting that followed would become legendary in military history, not for what was decided, but for what was promised. Eisenhower opened the meeting with words calculated to shift the psychological framework. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity, for us, and not of disaster, he said, his Kansas accent carrying clearly in the stone chamber. There will be only cheerful faces at this conference table. Patton responded immediately, grinning. Hell, let's have the guts to let the sons of bitches go all the way to Paris. Then we'll really cut them off and chew them up. The comment broke the tension, but also revealed Patton's fundamental misunderstanding of the political impossibility of allowing German forces to recapture France's capital. Eisenhower moved quickly to the essential question. He needed forces to strike the German southern flank, to take pressure off 1st Army and relieve Bastogne before it fell. He turned to Patton. When can you attack north? The room went silent. Everyone understood the magnitude of what was being asked. Patton did not hesitate. December 22nd, with 3 divisions. The response drew laughter from several officers who thought he was joking. Patton's face remained serious. This time, the Kraut stuck his head in a meat grinder, he continued, stabbing at the map with his finger, and I've got hold of the handle. Bradley, who knew Patton better than anyone in the room, stopped laughing first. He studied his subordinate's expression, looking for signs of bluff or bravado. What he saw was absolute confidence. Eisenhower, equally experienced in reading commanders, leaned forward. When can you start? Patton repeated his timeline. 72 hours to disengage from current operations, pivot 90 degrees, move 100 miles through winter conditions, and attack prepared German positions with 3 full divisions. The operational mathematics seemed impossible. A Korpsdienst movement of that scale typically required 2 weeks of planning and preparation under ideal conditions. The logistics of what Patton was promising began to sink in, as staff officers pulled out notebooks and started calculating. 3rd Corps, which would execute the movement, consisted of approximately 50,000 men. They would need to disengage from active combat operations against fortified positions, an evolution that normally took days to execute safely. The 3 divisions would have to move along roads already clogged with supply convoys, retreating forces from 8th Corps, and civilian refugees fleeing the German advance. Winter weather had turned those roads into ice rinks, where heavily loaded trucks skidded into ditches and collisions were routine. The divisions would arrive piecemeal, without time for reconnaissance or careful coordination. They would attack immediately upon arrival, giving German defenders time to prepare positions while American forces were still on the march. Every military principle taught at Staff College suggested the operation would fail. Patton reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. It was a coded message he had sent to his chief of staff the previous day. The code words were simple: commence execution of Operation Nickel, Operation Tin, and Operation Copper. These were contingency plans Patton had ordered developed starting December 12th, when he first became concerned about German activity in the north. While other commanders had dismissed intelligence reports of German concentrations, Patton had ordered his staff to prepare plans for moving north under 3 different scenarios. More than 50 officers had spent 5 days working on movement tables, route assignments, logistics calculations, and attack plans for an operation they had no orders to execute. The plans existed in complete detail, ready to be implemented. All that had been missing was the order to begin. Patton had sent that order 24 hours before arriving at Verdun, gambling that Eisenhower would need exactly what 3rd Army had prepared. The revelation that Patton had already begun moving forces before receiving official orders should have resulted in a reprimand for exceeding his authority. Instead, it produced grudging admiration from commanders who understood that Patton's willingness to bend rules had potentially saved the campaign. Bradley asked pointed questions about which divisions would move and what would hold Third Army's current front. Patton had answers ready. The 4th Armored Division, veteran tankers who had fought across France with him, would lead the movement. The 26th Infantry Division and 80th Infantry Division would follow, the latter unit being pulled from a rest area and thrown immediately into combat. The sectors they abandoned would be taken over by remaining forces spreading thin, but maintaining enough presence to prevent German counterattacks. It was a calculated risk, but everything about the Ardennes had become a calculation of acceptable risks. Eisenhower authorized the operation with the understanding that failure would be catastrophic. If Third Army attacked north and stalled, the forces would be stuck between two German armies with no easy line of retreat. If the movement itself broke down on the roads, corps would be scattered and vulnerable. If Bastogne fell before relief arrived, the operation would accomplish nothing except to move American forces into a salient they could not hold. The weight of these possibilities hung over the cold room as staff officers began coordinating details. Patton would report directly to Bradley for this operation, bypassing normal command channels to speed decision-making. Air support would be prioritized for Third Army once weather cleared, if it ever cleared. Artillery units from other sectors would shift north to provide fire support. Every resource that could be scraped together would flow toward making Patton's promise a reality. The meeting ended with handshakes and words of encouragement that barely masked the underlying tension. As commanders filed out into the winter afternoon, Patton placed a call to his headquarters in Luxembourg. His chief of staff answered immediately, having been waiting by the phone. "Execute," Patton said simply, then added, "The impossible is what we do before breakfast. The miraculous takes us until lunch." It was vintage Patton, mixing bravado with determination, but the men who received his orders understood the stakes. They would have 72 hours to achieve something that military doctrine said required 2 weeks. They would do it in the worst weather Europe had seen in years. They would do it while German forces were achieving local superiority and tactical success across the front. They would do it because their commander had promised it could be done, and because tens of thousands of American soldiers in Bastogne needed help that would come too late from any other source. The historical significance of the Verdun Conference would be debated by military scholars for decades. Some would argue that Patton's promise was reckless, that a more careful commander would have insisted on a week to prepare and moved with proper reconnaissance and coordination. Others would contend that 72 hours was still too slow, that Patton should have been moving forces north on December 17th, rather than waiting for official authorization. What was undeniable was that December 19th marked the moment when the Allied response to the German offensive shifted from defensive containment to offensive counteraction. Patton had promised the impossible. Now he would have to deliver it, and the men of Third Army would pay the price of that promise in blood and exhaustion on frozen roads leading north, toward a crossroads town most of them had never heard of. The sun set early over Verdun that December afternoon, casting long shadows across a city that had seen more than its share of desperate battles. Inside various headquarters, staff officers worked through the night updating plans, calculating tonnages, coordinating movements. Telephone and radio networks crackled with coded orders sending divisions into motion. In bivouacs and assembly areas across Luxembourg and eastern France, soldiers received word that the attack east was canceled, that they would be moving north, that they would be attacking as soon as they arrived wherever they were going. Few understood the scale of what was being asked. Most simply accepted that orders had changed, that the war had shifted again, that tomorrow would bring another march to another battle. The machinery of Third Army began its 90-degree pivot, and the question now was whether organizational momentum and individual courage could overcome the physics of distance, time, and winter warfare. December 12, 1944, 7 days before the Verdun Conference. Third Army Headquarters, Luxembourg City. Colonel Hallie Maddox entered General Patton's office expecting to discuss the upcoming Saar offensive. Instead, Patton pushed a map across his desk, showing terrain far to the north. "The Germans are going to attack through the Ardennes," Patton announced without preamble. Maddox, who served as Patton's operations officer, knew better than to immediately dismiss his commander's hunches. Patton had an uncanny ability to anticipate enemy moves, a skill he attributed to historical study, and claimed came from having fought these same Germans in previous lives. "I want contingency plans for moving 3rd Corps north," Patton continued. 3 scenarios. Work out everything: routes, timing, logistics, the whole staff estimate, and Hallie, do it quietly. I don't want anyone thinking I've lost confidence in our current operation. What Maddox did not know was that this order would make possible the relief of Bastogne. The request violated several principles of military staff work. Contingency planning was normal, but planning for operations outside your assigned sector, without orders from higher headquarters, risked wasting staff time on scenarios that would never materialize. 3rd Army was preparing to attack east through the Siegfried Line. Planning to move north suggested doubt about that mission's viability. More problematically, the detailed planning Patton demanded would require more than 50 officers to work for days on an operation that officially did not exist. If higher headquarters discovered the effort, questions would be asked about whether Patton was appropriately focused on his assigned mission. Maddox understood these risks, but he also understood Patton. When the general had one of his feelings about German intentions, those feelings were usually right. "How much detail do you want, sir?" Maddox asked. Patton's answer was immediate. "Everything. I want it ready to execute on 6 hours' notice." The staff officers who received assignments for the contingency planning did so with mixed feelings. Some saw it as Patton's ego, preparing for a dramatic intervention that would never be needed. Others recognized it as prudent military planning, wargaming alternatives so that if the situation changed, response time would be minimized. A few understood something deeper. Patton was reading German intentions through a combination of intelligence analysis and historical intuition that went beyond what conventional staff procedures could produce. He had studied the Ardennes terrain during quiet moments, noting how few American divisions held the sector, observing how the dense forest would provide cover for assembling attack forces, recognizing that the road network converging on Bastogne made it a natural objective. He had absorbed after-action reports from the Eastern Front showing German ability to concentrate forces secretly. He had put these pieces together and concluded an attack was coming, even though his own intelligence section and higher headquarters disagreed. The 3 contingency plans took shape over 5 intensive days. Operation Nickel assumed a German attack north of 3rd Army, requiring 1 division to move north while maintaining the Saar offensive. Operation Tin assumed a larger attack requiring 2 divisions and partial suspension of current operations. Operation Copper was the disaster scenario, a major German offensive requiring 3rd Army to disengage completely and commit 3 full divisions to a relief operation. Each plan required detailed calculations. How many vehicles would each division need? What routes would they use? Where would traffic bottlenecks occur? How would fuel and ammunition be pre-positioned? What would happen to the sectors they abandoned? The work expanded to fill every available staff hour, officers working in shifts through nights to complete estimates that might never be used. Movement tables were calculated to 15-minute intervals. Route reconnaissance was conducted on maps, since actually driving northern roads would reveal the planning. Supply dumps were identified based on map studies of rail lines and road networks. By December 17th, when fragmentary reports of the German offensive began arriving, the contingency plans existed in remarkable detail. 3-ring binders sat in safes containing everything from fuel consumption estimates to communications frequencies to liaison officer assignments. The plans had been wargamed, tested against various assumptions, revised based on feedback from division commanders who had been quietly consulted about their unit's capabilities. What the plans could not account for was weather, enemy resistance, or the fog of war that would inevitably complicate execution. They were theoretical exercises transformed into operational orders, paper schemes that would have to survive contact with reality. When Patton sent the coded message on December 18th, ordering commencement of Operation Copper, staff officers simply pulled the relevant binders from safes and began updating them with current unit positions and road conditions. The 5 days of advanced planning were compressed into hours of final preparation. The decision to plan without orders revealed something essential about Patton's command philosophy. He believed in what modern military doctrine would call mission command, giving subordinates clear objectives and trusting them to determine methods. but he also believed in anticipating his superiors' needs and preparing to fulfill those needs before being asked. This approach required accepting risk that more cautious commanders avoided. If the German attack had not materialized, the hours spent on contingency planning would have been wasted effort, time stolen from preparing for the Saar offensive. If higher headquarters had discovered the planning and disapproved, Patton would have faced criticism for exceeding his authority. If the plans failed when actually executed, the advance preparation would be blamed for inadequate attention to detail. Patton accepted all these risks because he believed the probability of a German attack justified the preparation, and because he understood that in war, speed often mattered more than perfection. The contingency planning also revealed Patton's deep study of military history, particularly the campaigns of Confederate General Stonewall Jackson in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. Jackson had moved his small army with such speed and unpredictability that he tied down Union forces many times larger. The key to Jackson's success was not just rapid marching, but having plans ready for multiple contingencies, allowing him to shift operations faster than his opponents could respond. Patton had studied these campaigns obsessively, filling notebooks with observations about how Jackson used interior lines and prepared alternatives to achieve surprise. The contingency plans for moving north were Patton applying Jackson's principles to mechanized warfare, using staff planning to create the preconditions for operational surprise, even when conducting movements that would normally telegraph intentions days in advance. The actual content of the plans showed meticulous attention to logistics, the unglamorous mathematics that determined whether bold operational concepts succeeded or failed. 4th Armored Division would need 240,000 gallons of fuel to move 100 miles and conduct initial combat operations. Where would that fuel come from? The plans identified existing dumps and calculated tonnages that could be diverted from the Saar operation. Ammunition expenditure was estimated based on combat intensity assumptions. If resistance was light, existing loadouts would suffice. If heavy, convoys would need to follow immediately with resupply. The plans calculated how many engineer units would be needed to clear roads, how many military police to manage traffic, how many medical units to handle anticipated casualties. This level of detail was possible only because staff officers had been given days to work through problems that would normally be solved in hours of crisis response. When Maddox briefed the final plans to Patton on December 18th, the general asked one question: "Can we do this?" Maddox's answer was carefully calibrated. "Sir, we can move the forces. We can get them to Bastogne. Whether we can get there in time and in condition to fight effectively depends on factors beyond our control: weather, enemy action, the cooperation of forces not under our command." Patton nodded, satisfied that his staff understood both the potential and the limitations. "Then we prepare to do our part perfectly and trust that God and the enemy's mistakes will handle the rest," he responded. It was the philosophy that had carried him across France, a combination of meticulous planning and aggressive execution that accepted risk as the price of opportunity. The contingency plans transformed that philosophy into orders that subordinate commanders could execute. The story of the contingency planning would remain classified for years after the war, emerging only gradually as staff officers wrote memoirs and historians gained access to Third Army records. When it became public, it generated debate about military decision-making at the highest levels. Had Patton shown prescient strategic vision, or simply gotten lucky that his paranoia about German intentions proved justified? Was planning for operations outside your assigned sector appropriate initiative or inappropriate freelancing? These questions missed the essential point. Patton's willingness to prepare for contingencies that higher headquarters dismissed as impossible created options when those contingencies materialized. The 72-hour timeline he promised at Verdun was possible only because of the 7 days of advance preparation that preceded it, the miracle that would unfold over the next week. The seemingly impossible pivot of an entire Army Corps rested on foundations of detailed staff work, performed by officers who thought they might be wasting their time on their commander's eccentric hunches. December 20th, 1944, 4 o'clock in the morning. The temperature had dropped to 10 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Along frozen roads throughout Luxembourg and eastern France, diesel engines coughed to life in the darkness. Drivers gunned accelerators, trying to warm vehicles that had been sitting in freezing temperatures all night. The noise built gradually, first a few engines, then dozens, then hundreds, until entire divisions rumbled with mechanical thunder. Convoy commanders checked watches against departure schedules printed on mimeographed orders. 4th Armored Division would move first, taking the northern route through Longwy. 26th Infantry Division would follow, using the same roads but staggered to prevent catastrophic traffic jams. 80th Infantry Division would take a more southern route, hoping to avoid the worst congestion. On paper, the movement was elegantly choreographed. In reality, it would become controlled chaos that tested every principle of military logistics. The first convoys pulled out exactly on schedule, a small victory for military precision. Sherman tanks rumbled onto icy roads, their tracks seeking purchase on surfaces that offered almost no friction. Drivers quickly learned that braking too hard meant sliding, that turning too sharply meant spinning, that maintaining proper interval was nearly impossible when vehicles responded unpredictably to control inputs. Within an hour, the first accidents occurred. A supply truck hit a patch of black ice and jackknifed across the road, blocking traffic until a wrecker could pull it clear. A tank threw a track trying to navigate a sharp turn, the crew frantically working in the dark to repair it while vehicles stacked up behind. A jeep carrying a battalion commander collided with a telephone pole in the pre-dawn darkness, sending the officer to an aid station with a concussion. Each incident created delays that rippled through the movement, schedules slipping by, minutes that accumulated into hours. Mid-morning, the scale of the logistics challenge became apparent. The two main roads heading north could theoretically handle 2,000 vehicles per day under normal conditions. Third Army was attempting to push 5,500 vehicles through those same roads in 24 hours, more than doubling the road's capacity, while winter weather reduced that capacity by at least a third. At crossroads where routes intersected, military police frantically directed traffic with whistles and flashlights, trying to maintain priority for units that needed to arrive first while preventing complete gridlock. The town of Longwy became a particular nightmare, 2 divisions' routes converging at a medieval bridge that could accommodate only 1 vehicle at a time. For 6 hours, traffic backed up for miles as military police manually directed each vehicle across the bridge in an alternating pattern that satisfied no one but prevented complete breakdown. The soldiers experiencing the movement had little understanding of the larger choreography. They sat in the backs of trucks or stood in open half-tracks, trying to stay warm as freezing wind cut through uniforms designed for garrison duty rather than winter warfare. Some men had been issued long underwear and overcoats. Others made do with wool shirts and field jackets. The temperature continued dropping as the day progressed, breath freezing on scarves wrapped around faces, hands going numb inside gloves that provided inadequate insulation. Every few miles, vehicles would halt as traffic compressed ahead. Men would dismount to stamp feeling back into frozen feet, urinate by the roadside, share cigarettes and rumors about where they were going and why. Few had accurate information. Most knew only that they were moving north towards some kind of emergency. Infantry divisions moving by foot faced different but equally challenging conditions. Soldiers marched in single file along road shoulders, allowing vehicles to pass on the paved surface. The pace was brutal, 20 miles in 24 hours, while carrying 60-pound packs and weapons. Men fell asleep while walking, stumbling into the soldier ahead before jerking awake. Some simply collapsed by the roadside, physically unable to continue, medics checking them for frostbite and exhaustion before loading them onto trucks if space existed. The march became a test of individual endurance multiplied across thousands of soldiers. Those who kept moving did so through combinations of unit cohesion, personal determination, and the simple fact that stopping meant freezing to death. By nightfall on December 20th, columns of infantry stretched for miles along roads, a river of men flowing north toward battles they could not yet imagine. Fuel logistics demanded constant improvisation. The movement consumed gasoline at rates that exceeded planned allocations. Trucks needed fuel to make the journey north. Tanks needed fuel not just for movement, but for running engines to keep crews from freezing. Engineer vehicles needed fuel to clear accidents and repair roads. The fuel convoys that normally supplied Third Army's operations were diverted to support the movement, creating a secondary logistics crisis as units still fighting on the Saar front began running short. Fuel officers made calculated decisions about which units to prioritize, sometimes diverting trucks mid-route based on urgent radio calls from division commanders who had run dry. The system worked through a combination of ruthless prioritization and acceptance that some units would arrive at their destinations with empty tanks, trusting that fuel would somehow be waiting when they got there. Accidents extracted a steady toll throughout the movement. 157 vehicles were damaged or destroyed in collisions, mechanical failures, or incidents caused by driver exhaustion and icy conditions. Some accidents were minor, fender benders that required quick assessment and pushing damaged vehicles off roads to keep traffic moving. Others were catastrophic. A fuel truck that skidded into a ditch and exploded, killing 3 soldiers and lighting up the night sky with flames visible for miles. A truck carrying ammunition that overturned, spilling crates across the road, and requiring explosive ordnance disposal teams to clear the hazard before movement could resume. Each accident consumed time, resources, and sometimes lives, the hidden cost of moving at speeds that safety considerations would never permit under normal circumstances. By December 22nd at noon, the first elements of 4th Armored Division reached assembly areas south of Bastogne. They had traveled roughly 100 miles in 60 hours, averaging less than 2 miles per hour when all stops and delays were calculated. By conventional military logistics, this was extraordinary. Staff colleges taught that winter movements of this scale required a week minimum. 3rd Army had done it in 3 days, but the cost was evident in the condition of units arriving. Soldiers slumped in exhaustion, many having slept less than 4 hours in the previous 72. Vehicles arrived with mechanical problems that had been ignored during the movement, tracks worn to dangerous levels, engines overdue for maintenance. Ammunition and fuel stocks were dangerously low, units having consumed their mobile loads just reaching the battlefield. The divisions were in position to attack, but whether they were in condition to attack effectively remained an open question. The movement statistics compiled by staff officers even as operations continued told the story in numbers. 133,178 men moved 50 to 100 miles. 11,000 vehicles made the journey, from motorcycles to heavy tank transporters. 62,000 tons of supplies accompanied the forces, everything from ammunition to medical supplies to food. The average movement rate was 20 miles per 24 hours, considered impossible by peacetime doctrine for winter conditions. The accident rate was 3 times higher than normal, but still resulted in only 1.4% of vehicles being lost. Acceptable, given the conditions. The statistics were compiled into after-action reports that would be studied by military planners for generations, case studies in what was possible when necessity demanded the impossible, and commanders were willing to accept risks that would never be tolerated in peacetime. The physical movement was only half the story. The psychological effect on German commanders watching American units disappear from their front and reappear days later 100 miles away was profound. German intelligence could track the movement through reconnaissance and radio intercepts, but understanding it intellectually was different from believing it could be done. The conventional wisdom among German staff officers was that American forces were logistically proficient, but operationally inflexible, capable of grinding advances but not rapid maneuver. The 3rd Army pivot challenged that assumption. It suggested that American operational capability was evolving, that German advantages in tactical flexibility and experienced leadership were being offset by American material superiority and improving command skills. This psychological dimension of the movement would influence German decision-making throughout the Bastogne fight, creating uncertainty about what American forces might do next. December 22nd, 1944, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Combat Command A of 4th Armored Division rolled toward the village of Bougainville, Belgium. The lead Sherman tanks moved cautiously along a road lined with snow-covered fir trees, commanders standing in open turrets scanning for threats. The village appeared quiet, almost peaceful, smoke from a few chimneys the only sign of habitation. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding 37th Tank Battalion, felt the familiar tension that preceded combat, senses heightened, mouth dry, mind running through contingencies. His tankers were veterans of the drive across France, but this felt different. They were attacking north into an enemy offensive, not pursuing a retreating foe. The Germans here would be fresh, aggressive, and fighting from prepared positions. What Abrams did not yet know was that the next 10 minutes would teach 4th Armored Division a brutal lesson about the difference between pursuit and breakthrough operations. The first German anti-tank gun fired from concealment at 300 yards, the high-velocity round punching through the frontal armor of the lead Sherman and transforming it into a funeral pyre in seconds. The crew bailed out, running across frozen fields while German machine guns tracked them. A second Sherman tried to reverse, presenting its thinner rear armor to the enemy, and took a round through the engine compartment that set fuel tanks ablaze. Within minutes, 4 Shermans were burning, black smoke rising into the gray winter sky. The neat column of tanks scattered, commanders trying to identify the anti-tank positions while buttoning up their hatches for protection. The problem was immediate and tactical. German guns were pre-sighted on the road, hidden in stone buildings and tree lines, supported by infantry with Panzerfausts who could destroy tanks at close range. American tanks were designed for mobility and reliability, not for absorbing the kind of punishment German anti-tank weapons delivered. The engagement at Bougainville became a microcosm of the tactical challenges 4th Armored would face throughout the relief operation. The division had trained and fought as exploitation forces, breaking through weak points and driving deep into enemy rear areas. Now they were being asked to conduct a frontal assault against prepared positions held by German paratroopers who had been rushed from the Netherlands specifically to block the American advance. 5th Parachute Division was not a first-line unit by late 1944 standards, but its soldiers were young, motivated, and well-led. They had used the 3 days since the offensive began to prepare defensive positions along every road leading to Bastogne, sighting anti-tank guns with fields of fire that turned roads into killing zones, mining approaches to force vehicles into these zones, and coordinating with mortar and artillery to deliver precision fires on choke points. By evening on December 22nd, 4th Armored Division had advanced 3 miles at a cost of 19 tanks and 250 casualties. Bastogne lay 22 miles away. At this rate, relief would take a week, and Bastogne did not have a week. Combat Command B tried a different approach, shifting to secondary roads that might be less heavily defended. They discovered that every bridge over streams and creeks had been demolished, forcing time-consuming detours or requiring engineers to construct bypasses while under fire. At Martelange, a single-blown bridge held up an entire combat command for 18 hours, German observers calling artillery fire on American engineers trying to span the gap. The bridge was eventually bypassed, but the delay demonstrated how effectively prepared demolitions could slow an advance, even when defenders lacked the strength to hold ground through direct combat. The first day's combat shattered assumptions that had shaped the initial plan. Staff officers had estimated 4th Armored could average 5 to 10 miles per day against moderate resistance. The reality was that every mile required brutal close combat. German defenders would fight for a position until overwhelmed, then fall back to the next prepared position a mile or 2 to the rear. There was no breakthrough moment when resistance collapsed. There was only grinding attrition, each village and crossroads purchased with American lives and German blood. The tankers who had expected to race to Bastogne's relief found themselves in the kind of methodical combat more typical of World War I than the mobile warfare they had practiced across France. The psychological adjustment was difficult. These were men who thought in terms of speed and maneuver. Now they were being asked to accept casualties for minimal gains. The tactical mistakes of the first day would haunt post-action reviews. 4th Armored attacked with the aggressiveness that Patton demanded, but without the infantry support that breakthrough operations required. Tanks advanced ahead of the infantry, presenting targets for anti-tank weapons, without the foot soldiers who could clear enemy positions before armor was exposed. Reconnaissance was inadequate, units driving into ambushes that proper scouting would have detected. Artillery support was uncoordinated, available guns not yet having displaced forward from the movement north. The division was attacking piecemeal as units arrived from the road march, unable to concentrate force at decisive points. These were errors born of haste, the price of Patton's 72-hour timeline. 4th Armored was in position to attack, but not in condition to attack effectively, and German defenders were making them pay for every tactical shortcoming. Individual acts of courage marked the fighting, even as the broader operation struggled. A platoon leader, whose tank was destroyed, led his surviving crew in an infantry assault on a German strongpoint, capturing an anti-tank gun and turning it against its former owners. A company of infantry advancing through woods held their position under heavy fire until tanks could flank the German defenders, then charge forward while tankers provided covering fire. These small unit actions demonstrated the determination that would eventually overcome German resistance. but they also highlighted how much Third Army was asking of soldiers who were exhausted from the movement north and facing an enemy who held every advantage of position and preparation. The question emerging by nightfall on December 22nd was whether determination alone would be sufficient. German defenders at Bougainville and other villages along the approach to Bastogne were themselves surprised by the speed of American response. They had expected days or even weeks before significant American forces could concentrate for a relief operation. Instead, they were fighting American armor within 72 hours of the offensive beginning. This was both encouraging and concerning for German commanders. Encouraging because the American attacks were disorganized and taking heavy casualties. Concerning because if the Americans could move forces this quickly, the broader offensive timeline was in jeopardy. German success depended on reaching the Meuse River before American reinforcements could arrive in strength. The appearance of Third Army, divisions north of Bastogne suggested American operational flexibility exceeded German estimates, a strategic problem that tactical success at Bougainville could not solve. The evening of December 22nd found 4th Armored Division commanders reassessing their approach. Radio communications with 3rd Army headquarters brought both encouragement and pressure. Patton wanted to know why progress was slower than anticipated. Division commanders tried to explain the reality on the ground. German resistance was prepared and determined. Terrain favored the defense. Attacking in winter darkness was nearly impossible. Patton's response was predictable. Attack harder, move faster. Accept casualties as the price of speed. The tension between operational urgency at Army level and tactical reality at division level would persist throughout the relief operation. What was clear to everyone listening to those radio conversations was that the initial estimate of a rapid drive to Bastogne had been dangerously optimistic, and that reaching the surrounded garrison would require a different approach than anyone had planned. December 20th, 1944, evening. Bastogne, Belgium. Trucks carrying the 101st Airborne Division roared into town, depositing confused paratroopers who had been pulled from rest areas in France with minimal notice. The soldiers wore summer-weight uniforms because their winter gear had not arrived before they were ordered to move. Many carried less than a basic load of ammunition, trusting that supply trucks would follow. Acting Division Commander Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe established headquarters in a Belgian army barracks and immediately began receiving briefings that painted an increasingly dire picture. German forces were approaching from 3 directions. 8th Corps, which had held this sector, was in full retreat. The roads leading into Bastogne were clogged with American units streaming west in disorder, many having abandoned equipment in their haste to escape encirclement. McAuliffe's mission was simple in concept and terrifying in execution. Hold Bastogne at all costs until relief arrived. How long that would take, nobody could say. The strategic importance of Bastogne was written in its geography. 7 major roads converged on this market town of 4,000 Belgian civilians. Control those roads and you controlled movement through the entire central Ardennes. For German forces pushing west, Bastogne represented both an obstacle and an opportunity. Capture it, and reinforcements and supplies could flow smoothly forward. Leave it in American hands, and every German advance west of the town was vulnerable to flank attacks from the garrison. Hitler had specifically identified Bastogne as a critical objective, and German commanders had allocated substantial forces to its capture. 3 divisions were converging on the town from different directions, their orders to take Bastogne quickly and continue the westward advance. What they did not know was that American paratroopers were already arriving to defend what German planners had assumed would be an undefended road junction. The units that would defend Bastogne represented a cross-section of American forces in Europe. 101st Airborne provided the core garrison, elite troops with combat experience from Normandy and Holland. Combat Command B of 10th Armored Division had been rushed north from Patton's 3rd Army, arriving just hours before German forces cut the last road. Artillery units from 8th Corps fell back into the town rather than west towards safety, their commanders deciding that defending Bastogne offered better odds than running a gauntlet of German armor. Stragglers from shattered units flowed into the perimeter, soldiers who had become separated from their parent organizations and now found themselves defending a town they could barely locate on a map. By December 21st, approximately 18,000 American soldiers occupied Bastogne and the surrounding countryside. They faced German forces estimated at 45,000 men with substantial armor support. The encirclement closed with brutal efficiency. On December 20th, roads to the west remained open, American units and Belgian civilians streaming out while reinforcements moved in. By the afternoon of December 21st, German forces had seized all major roads. The last route out, a secondary road to the southwest, was cut when German tanks overran American positions holding the approach. Soldiers in Bastogne could hear the gunfire as the escape route closed, the sound marking their transition from defenders to besieged. Radio communications with higher headquarters confirmed what everyone already understood. They were surrounded, relief force was being organized but would take days to arrive. Mission was to hold regardless of cost. The psychological impact of encirclement varied by individual. Veterans of Normandy had experienced desperate combat and found some comfort in familiar procedures. Replacements who had joined units just days earlier faced the terrifying realization that their first major combat would be a siege. German commanders recognized that Bastogne needed to fall quickly. Every day the garrison held was a day that the western advance stalled, supplies backed up, and the tight offensive schedule slipped. On December 22nd, a German delegation approached American lines under a white flag. They carried a formal surrender demand, typed on clean paper, and delivered with military courtesy. The message was clear. The garrison was surrounded, resistance was futile, honorable surrender would save lives and earn proper treatment. The German officers who delivered the message expected a considered response, perhaps negotiations about terms. Instead, they received a single-word reply that would become legendary: nuts. McAuliffe's response reflected his assessment of the situation. Yes, they were surrounded. Yes, supplies were limited, but relief was coming, and American soldiers did not surrender when fighting remained possible. The German officers departed confused by the idiom, which had to be explained to them by an American translator. It means, go to hell. The siege quickly settled into a pattern that would persist until relief arrived. German forces probed the perimeter daily, looking for weak points that could be exploited. American defenders fought from positions that improved each day as engineers and infantrymen dug deeper, brought up more ammunition, and coordinated fields of fire. Artillery became the garrison's decisive advantage. The guns that had retreated into Bastogne gave American forces the ability to mass fires rapidly on any German attack. Forward observers called down concentrations that shattered German assault formations before they could close with American positions. The problem was ammunition. Artillery consumed shells at prodigious rates. The garrison began with a comfortable supply but lacked any means of resupply once surrounded. By December the 23rd, ammunition rationing began. Artillery batteries limited to 10 rounds per gun per day, a fraction of normal expenditure rates. Every shell had to count. The weather that had aided German offensive operations now became a liability for the Bastogne garrison. Fog and clouds that grounded American tactical aircraft also prevented resupply by air. The surrounded forces needed everything: ammunition, medical supplies, food, fuel. Airdrops were planned, but impossible to execute when clouds dropped to 200 feet and visibility measured in dozens of yards. Garrison soldiers watched the sky, waiting for the clouds to break, knowing that relief in the form of C-47 transport aircraft loaded with supplies could arrive within hours if weather permitted. On December 23rd, the clouds finally lifted. The morning dawned clear and cold, visibility extending for miles. Within hours, American and British aircraft were over Bastogne, cargo doors open, bundles tumbling out attached to parachutes of various colors. White for ammunition, colored for other supplies. Some bundles landed within the perimeter and were immediately retrieved. Others drifted into German lines, prompting firefights as both sides tried to recover the precious cargo. The air resupply operation transformed the siege. 241 tons of supplies dropped between December 23rd and December 26th, with 95% of that tonnage recovered by American forces. The supplies included ammunition in quantities sufficient to lift rationing, medical supplies that allowed aid stations to function properly, and food that supplemented dwindling rations. Equally important was the psychological impact. The appearance of hundreds of aircraft overhead, braving German anti-aircraft fire to drop supplies, demonstrated to the garrison that they had not been forgotten. Relief forces were coming. Higher headquarters was supporting them. They simply had to hold until ground forces fought through. The airdrops converted a potentially untenable situation into something sustainable, buying time that tactical situation required, but logistics could not normally support. The civilians of Bastogne became unwilling participants in the siege. 4,000 Belgian men, women, and children found themselves trapped in cellars and basements as artillery fell and street fighting raged. American medical personnel treated civilian casualties alongside military wounded, stretching already limited supplies. Some civilians helped American forces, serving as guides to local terrain, providing information about German movements, offering what food and shelter they could spare. Others simply tried to survive, huddled in underground shelters while armies fought over their town. The civilian experience of the siege would largely be forgotten in American accounts that focused on military heroics, but for the people of Bastogne, these days represented trauma that would echo through generations. Their town became a battlefield. Their homes were destroyed. Their lives were suspended in terror, all because geography had placed them at a road junction that armies needed to control. By December 26th, the Bastogne garrison had held for 5 days against sustained German attacks. Casualties mounted daily but remained sustainable given the garrison's size. Ammunition, replenished by airdrops, sufficed for the level of combat being experienced. Food was short but not critical. The perimeter had contracted slightly as German pressure forced abandonment of some forward positions, but core defensive positions remained intact. The crucial question was time. Intelligence estimates suggested relief forces were close but still fighting through determined German resistance. How much longer could the garrison hold? The answer depended on variables beyond anyone's control: German willingness to accept casualties attacking the perimeter, effectiveness of relief force operations, and whether German commanders would divert forces from the western advance to reduce Bastogne. As December 26 dawned, defenders scanned southern horizons, listening for the sound of American tanks that would signal the siege was ending. December 23, 1944, evening. 4th Armored Division Headquarters, a commandeered farmhouse 5 miles south of Bastogne. Combat commanders gathered around maps lit by kerosene lanterns, the electric generator having failed hours earlier. The mood was grim. 2 days of frontal assaults had gained less than 5 miles at a cost that made even hardened veterans wince. 19 tanks destroyed, over 400 casualties, and Bastogne is still 17 miles away. Major General Hugh Gaffey, commanding 4th Armored, listened as his subordinates reported tactical realities that contradicted every assumption underlying the relief operation. German defensive positions were stronger than anticipated. Roads were killing zones. Frontal attacks were being shredded by anti-tank guns before American forces could close with defenders. The tactics that had worked during the pursuit across France were failing against an enemy who held terrain advantages and fought from prepared positions. Something had to change, or the relief operation would bleed to death before reaching its objective. The problem was doctrinal as much as tactical. American armored doctrine in 1944 emphasized speed and exploitation. Tanks were supposed to find weak points, break through, and drive deep into enemy rear areas while infantry mopped up bypassed positions. This approach had worked brilliantly from Normandy to the German border against an enemy in retreat. Now 4th Armored faced an enemy who was not retreating, who had prepared positions in depth, who coordinated anti-tank weapons with infantry and artillery to create interlocking fields of fire that channeled American attacks into predetermined kill zones. The division's aggressive mentality, normally an asset, had become a liability. Commanders were ordering attacks that brave men executed with determination that could not overcome tactical disadvantages. Courage was getting soldiers killed without achieving objectives. The after-action discussions that evening marked the beginning of a fundamental tactical shift. Junior officers who had actually led the attacks spoke with unusual candor. A company commander from 37th Tank Battalion described watching his tanks destroyed one by one because they advanced without infantry support to suppress anti-tank weapons. A platoon leader from the attached 51st Armored Infantry Battalion explained how his men had been pinned down by machine gun fire because tanks had pushed ahead rather than advancing together. The pattern repeated across multiple engagements. Armor and infantry were fighting separate battles instead of coordinated operations. American tanks would advance, hit German anti-tank positions, and pull back with losses. Infantry would then attack the same positions without armor support and take casualties from machine guns and mortars. The Germans were defeating American attacks by exploiting the gap between armor and infantry, a textbook defensive technique that required attackers to fight as integrated teams rather than separate arms. The solution emerged from discussions rather than orders. Small unit leaders who had survived the first days of combat shared observations about what worked. A lieutenant described bypassing a German strongpoint at night, using darkness to avoid anti-tank fire, then attacking from an unexpected direction at dawn. A sergeant explained how his squad had ridden on the back of tanks, dismounting only when close to objectives, maintaining the intimate coordination between armor and infantry that doctrine preached but units rarely practiced. A tank platoon leader noted that attacking along multiple routes simultaneously forced Germans to divide their anti-tank weapons, reducing the concentrated fire that made frontal approaches so deadly. These tactical innovations were not revolutionary. They were application of basic combined arms principles that had been lost during months of exploitation warfare when enemy resistance was minimal. December 24th saw the first attempts to implement new approaches systematically. Instead of company-sized frontal attacks, 4th Armored began using platoon-sized teams, 5 tanks, 30 to 40 infantry, and an engineer squad. The tanks provided firepower and mobility. Infantry suppressed anti-tank weapons and cleared buildings. Engineers removed obstacles and mines. The teams moved by bounds, one element providing covering fire while another advanced, reversing roles every few hundred yards. When they encountered strong resistance, they did not attack frontally but attempted to infiltrate around flanks, using terrain and darkness to avoid being channeled into kill zones. The approach was slower than division commanders wanted, but more effective than what had been attempted previously. Casualty rates dropped 40%, while ground gained increased. The brutal mathematics of attrition began shifting in American favor. Communication between armor and infantry became critical to the new tactics. Infantry could not ride inside tanks, the interior space being occupied by crew and ammunition, so they rode on the outside, clinging to handholds while tanks maneuvered. This practice, forbidden by peacetime safety regulations, allowed infantry to dismount immediately when fighting started, rather than having to debark from separate vehicles under fire. Tanks and infantry used the same radio frequencies, allowing instant coordination when targets appeared. Tank commanders learned to trust infantry assessments of when anti-tank weapons were suppressed enough to advance. Infantry learned to trust tank commanders about when armor support was available and when infantry had to fight alone. This mutual trust, built in hours of desperate combat, transformed separate arms into integrated teams that were greater than the sum of their parts. German defenders adapted as well, creating a tactical evolution that both sides experienced. When Americans began bypassing strong points, Germans pulled back from forward positions to avoid being cut off, establishing new defensive lines further north. This created gaps in German defenses, but also lengthened American supply lines and forced attacking units to clear bypassed positions before those positions could threaten resupply routes. When Americans began night movements, Germans increased illumination using flares and pre-sighted artillery on likely approach routes, making night attacks more costly. The tactical contest became a chess match, each side adjusting to the other's innovations, searching for temporary advantages before the enemy countered. 4th Armored's evolution was not toward a perfect solution, but toward methods that worked well enough to sustain forward momentum despite German resistance. The psychological impact of tactical adaptation was as significant as the physical results. Soldiers who had felt helpless watching friends die in futile frontal attacks now believed they were fighting intelligently. Company commanders who had been ordered to attack regardless of casualties could now advocate for approaches that balanced aggression with survivability. The division was learning at brutal speed, compressing lessons that normally took months of training into days of combat. Battalion and regimental commanders who had served in North Africa and Italy recognized the pattern. Green units learned through costly mistakes. Veteran units refined tactics through experience. 4th Armored was accelerating that maturation process, paying the tuition in blood, but earning the knowledge that would make subsequent operations more effective. By December 25th, 4th Armored had advanced 8 miles from its starting positions. This was less than half the distance needed to reach Bastogne, but represented progress that tactical changes made sustainable. The division was still taking casualties, but at rates that allowed continued operations rather than requiring pauses to rebuild combat power. German resistance remained fierce but was no longer stopping American advances cold. The evolution from pursuit force to breakthrough force was incomplete, but 4th Armored was becoming more effective with each day of combat. The question was whether this evolution was happening fast enough to reach Bastogne before the garrison situation became critical. Time remained the enemy that no tactical innovation could completely defeat. The lessons being learned by 4th Armored in December 1944 would shape American armored doctrine for decades. Post-war analysis would identify the Bastogne relief operation as a case study in tactical adaptation under pressure. Staff colleges would teach how junior officers' observations drove changes that senior commanders accepted, despite contradicting established doctrine. The specific techniques developed in those desperate days, infantry tank teams operating at platoon level, night infiltration to avoid enemy anti-tank fire, combined arms coordination maintained through physical proximity rather than elaborate communications, would become standard practice. But in the moment, surrounded by winter darkness and German fire, the soldiers of 4th Armored understood only that they were finding ways to survive and advance, techniques born of necessity and refined through the harshest teacher imaginable. Combat against a skilled enemy who punished every mistake and exploited every hesitation. December 23, 1944, dawn. Inside. A half-track serving as a forward command post, a radio operator wearing headphones hunched over an SCR 508 radio set, slowly turning the frequency dial. Static hissed and crackled, punctuated by bursts of German voices and the occasional squeal of jamming attempts. He was searching for a specific frequency, one that would connect him with the Bastogne garrison 15 miles to the north. The radio's effective range under ideal conditions was 20 miles. Current conditions, with low clouds and hills blocking line of sight, were far from ideal. He adjusted the antenna angle, checked power connections, and transmitted the call sign that 3rd Corps and 101st Airborne had agreed to use. Nothing but static. He tried again, slowly enunciating the code words that would identify him as friendly. This time, faintly beneath the interference, a voice responded. Contact was established. The invisible battle for communications had begun, a struggle as vital to the relief operation as any firefight, but largely unknown to the soldiers who would benefit from its success. Radio communications in December 1944 required constant attention and improvisation. The equipment was temperamental under the best conditions, prone to failure when exposed to mud, moisture, and freezing temperatures that were standard in the Ardennes winter. Batteries lost 60% of their efficiency when temperatures dropped below freezing, requiring operators to warm them against their bodies or near vehicle engines before use. Antennas iced over, reducing signal strength and requiring regular clearing. The vacuum tubes that made the radios function were fragile, breaking from vibration or thermal shock when cold equipment was suddenly warmed. Every radio in the relief operation represented a minor logistics chain of batteries, spare tubes, antenna wire, and the technical knowledge needed to keep temperamental electronics functioning in conditions they were never designed to endure. The communication network connecting 3rd Army, 3rd Corps, 4th Armored Division, and the Bastogne garrison operated on multiple levels. Strategic communications between Patton's headquarters and Eisenhower's SHAEF used encrypted telephone lines that were reasonably secure but limited in bandwidth. Operational communications between corps and divisions relied on radio nets using high-frequency systems that could reach dozens of miles but were vulnerable to German interception and direction finding. Tactical communications between battalions and companies used shorter-range radios that were more secure, but had limited range and could not communicate with higher headquarters directly. Coordinating these layers required radio relay stations, operators who received messages on one net and retransmitted them on another, manually connecting the communications architecture that allowed a corps commander to talk to a company commander if necessary. German efforts to disrupt American communications were sophisticated and persistent. Direction-finding teams tracked American radio transmissions, using triangulation to locate headquarters and call in artillery strikes. American operators countered by limiting transmission time, moving frequently, and using low power settings that made direction finding more difficult. German jamming teams broadcast noise on frequencies they knew Americans used, forcing operators to shift frequencies and re-establish communications. Code words changed every 12 hours to prevent German intelligence from understanding intercepted conversations, even when they could listen to them. The radio war was a constant technical and intellectual contest, German specialists trying to blind and deafen American forces, while American operators fought to maintain the communications that modern warfare required. The coordination between Third Army artillery and the Bastogne garrison demonstrated what effective radio communications could achieve. Artillery battalions positioned south of the German lines surrounding Bastogne could fire in support of the garrison if they received accurate target information and fire direction. Forward observers with the garrison could see German concentrations forming for attacks, but lacked the artillery to engage them. The solution was radio coordination. Observers in Bastogne would call fire missions to Third Army artillery batteries, providing grid coordinates and descriptions. Artillery batteries would compute firing solutions and transmit shell-in-flight warnings, so garrison troops could take cover. The shells would land, observers would adjust fire, and German formations would be disrupted before they could assault the perimeter. Between December 23rd and December 26th, Third Army artillery fired more than 5,000 rounds in support of Bastogne, every round directed by radio communications across German-held territory. Air support coordination added another layer of complexity to the radio war. When weather cleared on December 23rd, fighter bombers from 9th Air Force began flying missions over the Bastogne sector. The aircraft needed targets. Ground forces could see targets but could not communicate directly with aircraft flying overhead. The solution was forward air controllers and small observation aircraft, Piper Cubs that orbited the battlefield at low altitude, slow enough to spot targets but vulnerable to German anti-aircraft fire. These controllers maintained radio contact with both ground units and fighter bombers, receiving target information from infantry and tankers, verifying targets visually, then directing fighter bombers to attack. The system required 3 separate radio nets functioning simultaneously: ground-to-air controller to fighters, and air controller back to ground for battle damage assessment. When it worked, German positions identified by ground forces were destroyed by aircraft within minutes. When it failed, usually because of radio malfunction or German jamming, frustrated ground troops watched aircraft orbit overhead while targets went unengaged. December 25th brought the radio war to its most intense phase. 4th Armored Division was preparing its push toward Ardennes, the village whose capture would open a corridor to Bastogne. The operation required precise coordination between armor, artillery, air support, and the garrison. Tank battalions needed to know which routes were most heavily defended so they could concentrate force. Artillery needed to suppress German anti-tank positions along the route of advance. Air support needed to strike German reserves before they could counterattack. The Bastogne garrison needed to be ready to attack outward when relief forces approached, linking up with the advancing column. All of this required radio communications functioning, despite German jamming, winter weather, and the chaos of combat. In the hours before the attack, radio operators checked and rechecked their equipment, warming batteries, testing connections, rehearsing frequencies and call signs until the procedures became automatic. The human dimension of the radio war often went unnoticed in historical accounts focused on tank battles and infantry assaults. Radio operators were typically young soldiers, many barely 20 years old, who spent entire days and nights wearing headphones in cramped vehicles or tents. They became intimately familiar with the voices of operators they never met, men at distant headquarters or forward positions whose voices became as recognizable as friends. When an operator was killed and a new voice appeared on a familiar call sign, the network mourned in brief, cryptic exchanges that expressed grief through military formality. The stress of maintaining communications under combat conditions led to exhaustion that was different from, but as debilitating as the physical exhaustion of infantry and tankers. An operator who missed a critical message because his attention wavered could cause friendly casualties or missed opportunities. The responsibility weighed heavily on young shoulders. By December 26th, when 4th Armored finally broke through to Bastogne, the radio war had been won as surely as any tactical engagement. Communications had functioned well enough to coordinate complex operations across multiple echelons. Artillery support had been delivered where needed. Air support had struck critical targets. The Bastogne garrison had maintained contact with higher headquarters, preventing the isolation from becoming complete psychological abandonment. German attempts to disrupt American communications had failed to achieve decisive effect. The invisible battle conducted by radio operators had enabled the visible battle fought by tankers and infantry. In after-action reports, senior commanders would note the critical importance of communications, but the specific contributions of individual operators would largely be lost in broader narratives about the relief operation. The radio war's legacy extended beyond the Bastogne operation. The techniques developed for maintaining communications in contested environments influenced post-war doctrine. The integration of air and ground communications became a model for close air support procedures. The use of relay stations and frequency hopping to counter jamming anticipated electronic warfare methods that would mature in later conflicts. For the soldiers who fought the radio war in the Ardennes, winter of 1944, the legacy was more personal. They had maintained the invisible threads that connected scattered forces into a coordinated whole. They had enabled commanders to command and soldiers to receive the support they needed. Their contribution was technical and unglamorous, but without it, the relief of Bastogne would have been impossible regardless of how many tanks and infantry participated. The radio war was won by specialists who never fired a shot, and that victory was as essential to the outcome as any combat engagement. December 25, 1944, dawn. A soldier in the 35th Infantry Division tore open a package that had arrived from home the previous day. Inside was a carefully wrapped fruitcake, already crumbling from rough handling during its journey across the Atlantic. A letter from his mother described the family's Christmas preparations, the tree in the living room, the hope that the war would end soon and he would be home. He read the letter twice, slowly, memorizing details about people and places that felt impossibly distant from the frozen forest where he sat. Then the order came to move out, and he repacked the fruitcake into his field pack, saving it for later. The package would be destroyed by artillery fire 3 days hence. The fruitcake scattered across Belgian mud, but in that moment, it represented connection to a world beyond war. Christmas Day 1944 would be remembered as a turning point in the Bastogne battle, not because of any single decisive engagement, but because it marked the day when weather, morale, and tactical momentum all shifted in American favor. The weather change began overnight. For 9 days, thick clouds had blanketed the Ardennes, grounding Allied aircraft and giving German forces freedom to maneuver in daylight. Christmas Eve brought the first bones of clearing. Clouds thinned. Stars became visible for the first time in over a week. Temperature dropped sharply, plunging to 10 degrees Fahrenheit by dawn, but the cold brought crystalline clarity that extended visibility for miles. Soldiers emerging from foxholes and vehicles on Christmas morning saw a landscape transformed. Frost coated every surface. Trees stood out in sharp relief against pale sky. Most importantly, the sky itself was visible, that precious commodity that meant American air power could finally engage. Within hours, the rumble of aircraft engines echoed across the front as fighter bombers from 9th Air Force took off from bases in France and Belgium, heading for the Ardennes with bomb racks and fuel tanks full. Christmas services were conducted wherever chaplains could gather groups of soldiers. In forests behind the front lines, men stood in circles while chaplains read from field Bibles and led prayers that acknowledged the strangeness of celebrating Christ's birth while preparing to kill. The contrast was not lost on participants. Some found comfort in religious ritual, a reminder that larger frameworks of meaning existed beyond the immediate horror of combat. Others went through the motions out of respect for tradition or superstition, hedging metaphysical bets in case divine intervention proved real. One service in the 80th Infantry Division sector was interrupted by German artillery. Soldiers scattered to cover, the chaplain grabbing his Bible and diving into a nearby foxhole. When the barrage ended, the men reassembled, and the chaplain continued reading from where he had been interrupted, his voice steady despite hands that shook from adrenaline. The service concluded with the Lord's Prayer, dozens of voices speaking words that had been spoken by soldiers in countless wars across millennia. Efforts to provide Christmas dinner demonstrated the Army's institutional commitment to morale, despite operational constraints. Mess sergeants had been working for days to prepare turkey dinners for frontline troops, using supplies that had been shipped forward specifically for the holiday. In rear areas where combat was not imminent, the meals were served hot from field kitchens. Closer to the front, mess personnel loaded insulated containers onto trucks and drove toward forward positions, hoping to reach units before food cooled. to inedibility. One truck convoy carrying Christmas dinner for 10th Armored Division units in Bastogne was caught by German artillery 2 miles from the perimeter. The trucks were destroyed, turkeys and all the fixings scattered across a road that was already littered with the wreckage of war. The soldiers who should have received that meal ate cold rations instead, but the attempt mattered, the institutional message that even in combat, Christmas would be recognized. The resumption of air operations transformed the tactical situation. 242 sorties were flown on Christmas Day, American and British aircraft, striking German positions, supply columns, and troop concentrations. P-47 Thunderbolts dove on German tanks with 500-pound bombs and rockets. P-38s strafed infantry positions with 50-caliber machine guns. Medium bombers hit road junctions and railway yards behind German lines. The psychological impact was as significant as the material damage. German soldiers who had moved freely for 9 days now found themselves under constant air attack. American soldiers who had felt abandoned by higher headquarters saw friendly aircraft overhead and knew they were not alone. The appearance of air power did not immediately change the ground tactical situation, but it altered the psychological balance. Germans became more cautious, more defensive. Americans became more aggressive, more confident. The human cost of Christmas combat created stark contrasts between religious celebration and military necessity. 1,200 American soldiers were killed or wounded across 3rd Army's sector on December 25th, the highest single-day casualty toll since the turn north began. Aid stations were overwhelmed with wounded, medics working through the night to stabilize men who would be evacuated to rear-area hospitals if they survived the next 24 hours. One aid station chaplain moved between casualties, offering last rites to Catholic soldiers and prayers to Protestants, his vestments stained with blood from men he had tried to comfort. The theological questions raised by conducting religious services on a day when so many were dying in combat were not lost on thinking soldiers, but most were too exhausted and focused on immediate survival to engage in theological reflection. Christmas was simultaneously sacred and profane, meaningful and absurd, a marker of civilizational continuity and proof of civilization's failure. Mail delivery on Christmas Day provided unexpected morale boosts despite operational chaos. Postal units had worked extraordinary hours to move approximately 40,000 letters and packages forward to frontline units. The logistics of mail delivery during active combat were complex. Mail clerks had to know where units were located, even as those locations changed daily. Trucks carrying mail had to navigate the same contested roads as ammunition and fuel convoys. Letters and packages had to be sorted and distributed to individuals scattered across miles of front. That the system functioned at all was remarkable. That it functioned well enough to deliver mail on Christmas Day seemed almost miraculous to soldiers who received letters from home. The letters were windows into a world that continued to exist, where families gathered and children played, and people worried about mundane things that had nothing to do with combat. Reading those letters was simultaneously comforting and disorienting, a reminder that two realities existed simultaneously: the home front where Christmas was a holiday, and the combat zone where Christmas was just another day of trying not to die. The tactical significance of December 25th emerged in retrospect more than in real-time assessment. 4th Armored Division advanced 8 miles, the longest single-day gain since the relief operation began. German counterattacks against the Bastogne perimeter were disrupted by airstrikes and artillery. Resupply drops to the garrison delivered record tonnages. The psychological momentum that had favored Germans since December 16th began shifting. None of these changes were individually decisive, but cumulatively they marked a turning point. German commanders recognized that their window of opportunity was closing. American forces were concentrating faster than expected. Air superiority was reasserting itself. The offensive that was supposed to reach the Meuse River in a week had stalled 20 miles short of its intermediate objectives. Christmas Day did not determine the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge, but it marked the day when German defeat became probable rather than merely possible. As darkness fell on December 25th, soldiers on both sides of the lines settled into positions that would be familiar to veterans of earlier wars. Sentries strained to hear movement in the darkness. Machine gunners test-fired weapons to ensure they had not frozen. Officers checked positions and redistributed ammunition. The modern mechanized warfare of tanks and aircraft gave way to the timeless infantry struggle for survival in winter conditions. Some men wrote letters by candlelight, describing Christmas at the front in terms that would be censored before the letters reached home. Others simply tried to sleep, knowing that December 26th would bring more combat, more casualties, more grinding attrition. The war did not pause for Christmas. It merely allowed a few hours of reflection on the distance between the holiday's meaning and the reality of mechanized slaughter. That distance had troubled Christian soldiers since the Crusades, and it troubled soldiers in the Ardennes in 1944, most of whom were too young to have resolved the theological contradictions, but old enough to feel their weight. December 24th, 1944, midnight. A quartermaster depot 30 miles south of Bastogne hummed with activity that contradicted the late hour. Soldiers unloaded trucks by flashlight, stacking ammunition crates in precise rows, organizing supplies according to distribution lists that changed hourly as frontline priorities shifted. A captain stood over a makeshift desk, covered with requisition forms, trying to reconcile what units requested with what was actually available. The mathematics were brutal. 4th Armored Division needed 400,000 gallons of fuel daily to sustain operations. Artillery battalions were firing 12,000 rounds per day, 3 times peacetime planning estimates. Infantry units were consuming rations at rates that exceeded delivery capabilities. Medical supplies were running short as casualty rates exceeded projections. The entire Third Army logistics system was operating at 180% of designed capacity, a sustained overload that violated every principle of sustainable operations, but somehow continued functioning through improvisation, rule-breaking, and the stubborn refusal of soldiers to accept that impossible meant unachievable. The fuel supply chain demonstrated both the capabilities and fragility of American logistics in combat. Fuel arrived at ports in Normandy and Brittany, transferred to railway tank cars for movement to forward railheads, then loaded onto trucks for final delivery to division fuel points. Each transfer introduced inefficiency and opportunity for loss. Railway capacity was limited, requiring constant prioritization between fuel, ammunition, food, and other supplies. Trucks consumed fuel, moving fuel forward, reducing the net amount delivered. Winter weather reduced vehicle efficiency, increasing fuel consumption across the entire system. Despite these challenges, Third Army consumed approximately 3 million gallons of fuel weekly during the Bastogne operation. The fuel came from everywhere, diverted from other armies, pulled from strategic reserves, even captured from German depots when opportunity allowed. Fuel officers made decisions about allocation that would have required approvals from multiple headquarters in peacetime, but were made by captains and majors in combat because waiting for approval meant units running dry. Ammunition logistics presented different but equally challenging problems. Artillery consumed ammunition far faster than any other weapon system. A single battalion of 105mm howitzers, firing at normal rates, could expend 100 tons of ammunition daily. 4th Armored Division, supported by multiple artillery battalions, consumed 300 tons of ammunition daily during the Bastogne relief. This ammunition had to be moved from ammunition supply points to firing positions, often under fire, sorted by caliber and fuse type, and distributed to individual guns. The movement was constant, trucks arriving with ammunition, crews hand-loading rounds into ready racks, empty trucks returning for more loads. Ammunition handlers worked 20-hour shifts, sleeping in brief intervals between convoy arrivals. The physical labor was brutal, each 105mm round weighing over 40 pounds, thousands of rounds moved by hand every day. The danger was constant. Ammunition trucks were priority targets for German artillery, and direct hits caused catastrophic explosions. Ordnance units kept vehicles operational through repairs that officially violated procedure but practically worked. When a tank threw a track in combat, doctrine called for recovering the vehicle to rear area maintenance facilities for proper repair. Reality was that maintenance facilities were overwhelmed, and recovery would take days the combat situation could not afford. The solution was field expedient repair. Ordnance crews moved forward under fire, replaced damaged track sections with parts cannibalized from destroyed vehicles, and returned tanks to combat within hours. When replacement parts were unavailable, mechanics fabricated solutions from whatever materials could be scavenged. 3 damaged tanks might be cannibalized to create 2 functional vehicles. Engines were run beyond recommended service intervals. Transmissions that should have been replaced were jury-rigged to function a little longer. The result was a force that would have failed any peacetime inspection, but remained combat effective because mechanics understood that perfect was the enemy of good enough. The ration supply system struggled to keep soldiers fed under conditions that made regular meals nearly impossible. Standard doctrine called for 3 meals daily: breakfast before dawn, lunch at midday, dinner after dark. Combat reality meant that hot meals were rare luxuries. Most soldiers ate sea rations, canned meals that could be eaten cold or heated if circumstances allowed. The nutritional content was adequate, barely, but the monotony was crushing. After days of eating the same limited menu of canned hash, crackers, and instant coffee, soldiers lost appetite even though they needed calories for the energy expenditure of combat. Enterprising cooks tried to provide variety by combining sea ration components in different ways or adding liberated Belgian food when available. The Christmas turkey dinner effort, though it failed for many units, represented an attempt to provide both nutritional and psychological sustenance through familiar food that connected soldiers to memories of home and peacetime. Medical logistics operated under constraints that would have seemed impossible in peacetime. Casualty rates of 1,200 per day across Third Army during peak combat periods meant that approximately 50 men were killed or wounded every hour. Each casualty required immediate medical attention, evacuation if serious enough, and replacement if the unit was to maintain combat strength. The medical system was a pyramid. Battalion aid stations provided initial stabilization, regimental collecting stations did triage and prepared casualties for evacuation, division clearing stations performed surgery when necessary, and rear area hospitals handled long-term care. Moving casualties through this system required ambulances, medical supplies at each echelon, and personnel who were themselves at risk from combat. Medical units consumed vast quantities of morphine, plasma, bandages, and surgical supplies. When supply ran short, battlefield medicine returned to earlier war methods: tourniquets instead of plasma, whiskey instead of anesthesia, courage instead of adequate medical support. The replacement system attempted to maintain unit strength by feeding new soldiers into depleted units. Third Army required approximately 1,500 replacements daily to offset casualties. These men arrived from training centers in England and the United States, often with minimal preparation for the combat they were entering. They were assigned to units based on bureaucratic matching of skills to requirements, arriving at forward positions, confused and frightened, expected to fight effectively, despite having no relationship with the men whose holes they filled. The system was dehumanizing but necessary. Units could not maintain combat effectiveness if every casualty permanently reduced strength. The psychological cost of the replacement system was significant. Veterans resented new men who did not know unit procedures and whose mistakes endangered everyone. Replacements felt unwelcome and struggled to find their place in established social hierarchies. Many replacements became casualties before learning the survival skills that experience taught, perpetuating the cycle. The transportation network that moved all these supplies operated at capacity that engineering calculations said would cause system failure. Trucks ran 22 hours daily, far beyond the 12 hours that doctrine specified for sustainable operations. Drivers stayed awake using coffee, cigarettes, and amphetamines distributed by medical personnel who understood that sleep-deprived drivers were less dangerous than insufficient supply delivery. Accidents occurred regularly: trucks sliding off icy roads, collisions in darkness, mechanical failures from inadequate maintenance. Each accident removed a vehicle from the transportation pool, increasing the burden on remaining trucks. The system survived because drivers pushed themselves beyond reasonable limits and mechanics kept vehicles running through improvisations that peacetime supervisors would never have approved. The Red Ball Express, the famed truck convoy system that had supplied the race across France, was now operating in winter conditions over shorter distances, but with equal intensity. By December 26th, the logistics system supporting Third Army's operations had achieved what Staff College instructors would have said was impossible. Over 200,000 men were being supplied daily with fuel, ammunition, food, medical support, and replacements sufficient to sustain offensive operations in winter combat. The cost was measured in exhausted soldiers, worn-out equipment, and accepting risks that violated safety regulations. Supply officers worked impossible hours to reconcile requirements that exceeded resources. Transportation officers accepted accident rates that would cause investigations in peacetime. Medical personnel triaged brutally, focusing resources on soldiers who could be saved and returned to combat. The logistics of fury required accepting imperfection, embracing improvisation, and trusting that organizational momentum would carry the system through challenges that planning alone could never solve. The system worked not because it was well designed, but because thousands of individual soldiers in unglamorous roles made it work through determination that matched the combat soldiers they supported. December 26, 1944, 8 o'clock in the morning. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams stood in the turret of his Sherman tank, studying a map while his crew performed final checks on the vehicle. The target was Ardennes, village 5 miles north that intelligence suggested was more lightly defended than other approaches to Bastogne. 5th Parachute Division, which had fought so effectively to block earlier relief attempts, was stretched thin, covering multiple approaches. German commanders faced an impossible choice: defend everywhere and be weak everywhere, or concentrate and leave gaps. Abrams believed a gap existed at Ardennes. His 37th Tank Battalion, reinforced with infantry and engineers, would attack through that gap and reach Bastogne by nightfall. The plan was simple in concept, brutal in execution. Speed would be the weapon. Tanks would not stop to clear every German position. Infantry would suppress threats long enough for armor to push through. Once a column reached Bastogne, it would be widened and reinforced, but the initial breakthrough would be achieved through audacity rather than careful preparation. The attack formation was designed for penetration rather than broad front advance. 50 Sherman tanks formed the spearhead, arranged in column along a single road. Half tracks carrying 250 infantry followed immediately behind the tanks, close enough that infantry could dismount and engage threats within seconds. Artillery batteries displaced forward were ready to fire and support, observers riding with the lead elements to call fires as targets appeared. Fighter bombers orbited overhead, weather finally clear enough for sustained air operations, ready to strike German positions that threatened the column. The formation was vulnerable in multiple ways. A single well-placed anti-tank gun could destroy the lead tank and block the road, forcing the entire column to halt. German forces on either flank could fire into the column at close range. But Abrams gambled that speed would compensate for vulnerability, that German defenders would not have time to react before American armor had passed through their positions. 2:30 in the afternoon. The attack stepped off with artillery preparation that transformed Ardennes into a landscape of smoke and explosions. 105mm and 155mm shells fell in precise patterns designed to suppress German defenders without creating rubble that would block roads. The barrage lasted 10 minutes, shorter than doctrinal preparation, but long enough to force German soldiers into cover. As the last shells fell, the tank column surged forward. Abrams's tank led, its 75mm gun traversing to engage targets as they appeared. German machine gun positions opened fire, bullets sparking off armor with no effect. A Panzerfaust team rose from cover 50 yards away and fired, the rocket-propelled grenade missing by feet as the tank swerved. Infantry in the following half-track spotted the team and cut them down with machine gun fire. The column did not stop. Dead and wounded were left behind. The mission was Bastogne, not body count. German anti-tank, guns positioned at road junctions represented the greatest threat. These weapons, usually 88mm or 75mm guns, could destroy Sherman tanks at ranges where American tanks could not effectively respond. German crews knew the ranges to key points along likely avenues of advance, allowing them to fire accurately even through smoke and dust. The first anti-tank gun engaged the column from 300 yards, its high-velocity round punching through the frontal armor of the lead Sherman and killing the crew instantly. The tank slewed to a stop, burning, blocking half the road. The following tanks did not stop. They went around, some crushing through wooden fences to bypass the wreckage, others squeezing past on the narrow road shoulder. Infantry dismounted under fire, advanced on the anti-tank position using suppressive fire and maneuver, and destroyed the gun with grenades. Total time elapsed, 90 seconds. The column pushed forward, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The lead tanks reached Bastogne's perimeter. Paratroopers from 101st Airborne emerged from foxholes, initially suspecting a German trick before recognizing American markings. Handshakes and backslapping followed, as tankers and infantry celebrated a link-up that had seemed impossible days earlier. Abrams' tank, its armor scarred by hits that had not penetrated, stopped just inside the perimeter. The crew dismounted, legs shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. They had driven 5 miles through prepared German defenses in less than 2 hours, taking 4 tank losses and 30 casualties, but achieving the objective. The corridor was open, but it was terrifyingly narrow, 400 yards wide, German positions on both flanks, close enough that enemy soldiers could throw grenades onto the road. Supply trucks that followed the combat column came under fire from both sides. Drivers crouching low while maintaining speed, racing through a corridor that offered no protection except velocity. The immediate priority was widening the corridor before German counterattacks could seal it. Infantry from 26th Division began clearing villages on the corridor's flanks, fighting house-to-house combat that would continue for days. Engineer units worked under fire to clear mines from secondary roads, creating alternate routes in case the main corridor was blocked. Artillery battalions displaced forward into positions where they could fire in support of both the corridor and the Bastogne garrison. Every unit understood that the situation remained precarious. The corridor existed only because German forces had not yet concentrated to close it. Once German commanders realized what had happened, counterattacks would come from multiple directions. The race was to get enough American force through the corridor and establish defensive positions strong enough to withstand those counterattacks. Inside Bastogne, the arrival of the relief column transformed psychological more than physical situations. The garrison had been holding effectively and could have continued holding for several more days. What changed was the shift from siege mentality to offensive orientation. Soldiers who had been conserving ammunition now had resupply. Units that had been defending perimeter positions could now think about expanding those positions. Most significantly, the demonstration that Third Army could execute the relief changed calculations about future operations. The message was clear. American forces would not abandon units in difficulty. Relief would come, even if it required seemingly impossible operational maneuvers. This was significant for morale across all American forces in the theater, proving that the Ardennes crisis could be overcome through operational skill rather than just material superiority. The Germans' failure to prevent the Bastogne relief revealed limitations in their command structure and resource allocation. 5th Parachute Division had fought skillfully but lacked the strength to defend all approaches simultaneously. German armored reserves that might have sealed the corridor were committed to offensive operations west of Bastogne, Hitler's staff refusing to shift from offensive to defensive orientation until the relief made offensive operations untenable. German commanders at tactical level recognized the corridor's vulnerability and requested permission to counterattack immediately, but approvals came slowly through a command structure that was increasingly dysfunctional as the broader offensive stalled. By the time significant German forces could concentrate against the corridor, American reinforcements had widened it sufficiently that closing it would require resources Germany no longer possessed in the sector. As December 26th ended, the Bastogne corridor existed as a 400-yard-wide lifeline connecting the garrison to Third Army. It was vulnerable, contested, and inadequate for the supply flow that Bastogne required for sustained operations. But it existed, proof that operational boldness and tactical skill could overcome defensive advantages when speed and coordination were maintained. The story of the corridor's opening would become one of the most celebrated episodes in American military history, the subject of books, films, and military academy case studies. For the soldiers who created that corridor, the celebration came later, if at all. On December 26th, they were too exhausted to appreciate historical significance, too focused on immediate survival to understand they had participated in something that would be studied and debated for generations. They had done what was asked, achieved the impossible, and now faced the task of holding what they had won. December 27, 1944, dawn. Combat engineers from the 26th Infantry Division's Engineer Battalion advanced cautiously along the road corridor leading to Bastogne, metal, detectors sweeping for mines that German forces had planted during the previous weeks. Every few yards, the detectors would signal, metal beneath the road surface. Engineers would mark the spot, carefully excavate around the suspected mine, identify the type, and disarm it using procedures learned in training and refined through combat experience. Some mines were simple pressure-activated devices that would detonate when vehicles passed over them. Others were more sophisticated, anti-lifting mechanisms that would explode if the mine was moved, booby traps designed to kill engineers attempting clearance. In 6 hours, working under occasional sniper fire from German positions 300 yards away, the engineer platoon cleared 1,847 mines from a single mile of road. This was the unglamorous, dangerous work that transformed the narrow corridor into a sustainable supply route. The fighting to secure the corridor's flanks was methodical and brutal. German forces held villages and farm buildings on both sides of the road, positions from which they could fire on American traffic even if they could not physically block the route. 26th Infantry Division received the mission of clearing these positions, a task that required advancing perpendicular to the corridor's axis, fighting through prepared defenses while maintaining security for the supply line. Each village became a miniature battle. Riflemen would advance under covering fire from machine guns and mortars, working building to building, using grenades to clear rooms before entering. German defenders, often parachute infantry, or SS troops, fought with skill and determination, falling back only when positions became untenable. The fighting consumed ammunition at prodigious rates. 400 rounds per rifle in a day's combat was common, orders of magnitude higher than peacetime training estimates. Artillery played a decisive role in widening the corridor. Third Army concentrated more artillery in the Bastogne sector than any comparable frontage in the European theater. Battalions of 105mm howitzers, 155mm GIs, and even 8-inch heavy artillery were positioned where they could fire in support of corridor operations. The concentration allowed American forces to mass fires rapidly on any German position that threatened the corridor. Forward observers with infantry units would identify targets, call grid coordinates to fire direction centers, and watch as shells arrived within minutes. The psychological impact on German forces was significant. They could not concentrate for counterattack without attracting artillery fire. They could not move reserves in daylight without being spotted and engaged. The artillery dominance converted American material superiority into tactical advantage that German skill and determination could not overcome. Engineer units worked continuously to improve the corridor's infrastructure. The single road that initially connected to Bastogne was inadequate for sustained operations. Engineers constructed bypasses around destroyed bridges, using prefabricated Bailey Bridge sections that could be assembled quickly under combat conditions. They graded new roads through fields to create alternate routes parallel to the main corridor. They established crossing points over streams and creeks, building fords that trucks could use when bridges were not available. The work required moving earth with bulldozers while under fire, placing culverts while German snipers targeted the engineers, surveying routes while artillery fell sporadically. In 48 hours, engineers transformed a single vulnerable road into a network of routes that could sustain the traffic volume Bastogne required. Supply flow through the corridor increased dramatically as infrastructure improved. On December 26th, only 40 tons of supplies reached Bastogne through the corridor, trucks racing through under fire with minimal cargo. By December 28th, 400 tons per day were flowing through, ammunition and fuel stockpiles in Bastogne growing from critical to adequate. Medical evacuation became possible, casualties who had been treated in Bastogne's overwhelmed aid stations now being evacuated to rear-area hospitals with better facilities. Mail arrived, connecting garrison soldiers to home for the first time in over a week. The psychological transformation was as significant as the material improvement. Bastogne shifted from isolated garrison making last stands to forward operating base connected to larger American forces. The cost of securing and widening the corridor was measured in casualties that often went unrecorded in popular histories. 26th Infantry Division suffered 400 casualties in 48 hours of fighting to clear the corridor's flanks, a casualty rate that would have been news if it occurred during peacetime but became a footnote in the larger Bastogne story. Combat engineers lost men to mines, snipers, and artillery while conducting clearance operations. Artillery crews endured German counter-battery fire aimed at suppressing the guns that dominated the battlefield. Each casualty was an individual tragedy, a soldier whose war ended in evacuation or death, whose family would receive a telegram or visit from casualty notification officers. The operational success of widening the corridor made these casualties strategically meaningful, but did not make them less painful for the individuals and families affected. German artillery attempted to interdict the corridor through harassment and interdiction fires. German gunners could not observe the corridor directly, having been pushed back by American advances, but they knew the roads and could fire on map coordinates even without forward observers. Shells fell randomly on the corridor, killing or wounding soldiers and destroying vehicles with no pattern that allowed prediction or defense. The randomness made the shelling psychologically worse than direct combat. In a firefight, soldiers could shoot back, take cover, feel some agency over their survival. Artillery falling from positions miles away offered no target for counterfire, no way to defend except luck and hope that the next shell landed somewhere else. Soldiers driving supply trucks through the corridor learned to maintain speed regardless of artillery, trusting that movement was safer than stopping. Wreckage along the corridor bore testimony to occasions when that calculation proved wrong. The expansion of the corridor from 400 yards to 1,200 yards over 48 hours represented operational success that enabled strategic outcomes. With a corridor 1,200 yards wide, German forces could no longer effectively fire on the main supply routes with small arms. Artillery remained a threat, but could be countered by American counter-battery fire. The corridor became sustainable rather than precarious, capable of supporting not just the Bastogne garrison, but offensive operations from Bastogne toward the German forces that had created the Bulge. The widening marked the transition from defensive relief operation to offensive exploitation, Third Army preparing to attack north from Bastogne toward Houffalize, where link-up with First Army would cut off German forces still occupying the Bulge's western tip. By December 28th evening, the corridor's security was sufficient that senior commanders could visit Bastogne without exceptional risk. Patton flew to Bastogne in a light observation aircraft, landing on a hastily prepared airstrip inside the perimeter. He toured defensive positions, spoke with McAuliffe and other garrison commanders, and assessed the situation personally. His presence was a calculated gesture, demonstrating to soldiers that their sacrifices had achieved objectives that warranted Army commander attention. Patton awarded medals to soldiers who had distinguished themselves during the siege, brief ceremonies that recognized individual valor. He also pressed for continued aggressive operations, his natural inclination toward attack reasserting itself now that immediate crisis had passed. The visit lasted 3 hours before Patton returned to his headquarters, where he began planning the next phase of operations. Not just holding Bastogne, but using it as the springboard for destroying the German forces that had created the Bulge. December 29, 1944, pre-dawn. In forests east of the Bastogne corridor, German tank crews performed final checks on their Panthers and Panzer IVs. Panzer Lehr Division, veteran armored formation that had fought from Normandy to the Ardennes, was preparing its final significant offensive operation of the war. Division Commander Major General Fritz Bayerlein had orders from 5th Panzer Army: attack the Bastogne corridor, cut the American supply line, isolate the garrison again. Success would restore German operational possibilities that the corridor's opening had foreclosed. Failure would mean Panzer Lehr, already reduced to 47 operational tanks from the over 200 it had fielded in June, would be finished as an effective fighting force. Bayerlein understood the stakes. He also understood that American forces now occupied the corridor in strength, that air superiority had shifted decisively, and that the surprise that had enabled earlier German success was gone. The attack would proceed anyway, because orders demanded it and because German forces rarely questioned orders, even when tactical judgment suggested they should. American intelligence had advance warning of the attack through multiple sources. Ultra-intercepts of German radio communications revealed Panzer Lehr's movement toward the corridor. Aerial reconnaissance spotted tank concentrations in forests east of the American positions. Prisoners captured in small patrol actions mentioned rumors of a major attack being prepared. This intelligence allowed American commanders to prepare defenses and concentrate forces at the likely impact point. 35th Infantry Division, holding the corridor's eastern flank, reinforced positions with additional anti-tank guns, pre-registered artillery on likely German assembly areas, and coordinated with 4th Armored Division to have tanks available for counterattack if German armor penetrated the initial defensive line. The Americans would not be surprised this time. The question was whether foreknowledge would be sufficient to stop an attack by veteran German armored forces fighting with the desperation of soldiers who understood they were losing the larger campaign. 8 o'clock in the morning, December 29th. German artillery preparation began with intensity that matched the opening barrage of December 16th. Shells fell on American positions along a 3-mile front, targeting strongpoints, suspected command posts, and artillery positions. The barrage demonstrated that German artillery still functioned effectively, despite fuel and ammunition shortages. American soldiers huddled in foxholes, waiting for the barrage to lift and the attack to begin. At 8:30, the first German tanks appeared through morning fog, Panthers advancing in formation with infantry following in half tracks. The Germans attacked with the skill and coordination that had made Wehrmacht armored forces legendary in earlier years of the war, but they faced American defenders who had learned from earlier mistakes and were prepared to make the Germans pay for every yard of ground. The initial German attack achieved penetrations that threatened to cut the corridor. German Panther tanks, superior in armor and gun to American Shermans, destroyed American anti-tank positions at long range before American crews could effectively respond. Infantry following the armor overran forward American positions, the weight of the attack pushing through the first line of defense. By noon, German forces had advanced 1,200 yards, cutting a secondary supply route and coming within 600 yards of the main corridor road. The penetration was the deepest German advance since December 22nd, achieved through tactical skill and concentrated force against a single point. For several hours, the situation appeared critical. If German forces could push another half-mile, they would physically control the corridor and isolate Bastogne again. American commanders scrambled to organize counterattacks and seal the breach. American response combined all available assets in a coordinated counterattack. Artillery batteries concentrated fires on the German penetration, firing 12,000 rounds in 6 hours, the heaviest artillery concentration of the entire Bastogne operation. Fighter bombers from 9th Air Force flew 156 sorties despite marginal weather, pilots making multiple runs against German armor with beams, rockets, and napalm. This was the first operational use of napalm in Europe, jellied gasoline that created fireballs capable of incinerating tanks and infantry. The psychological impact was devastating. German tank crews abandoned vehicles that were not destroyed but had been showered with burning napalm, preferring to face small arms fire than burn alive. Infantry that had been advancing stopped and dug in, as American counterattacks supported by armor and massed artillery struck their positions from multiple directions. By nightfall, December 29th, the German attack had failed. 41 German tanks were destroyed, losses that Panzerlehr could not absorb. Infantry casualties exceeded 800, mostly from artillery and air attack. The penetration that had threatened the corridor by noon had been compressed back to starting positions by evening, American forces regaining ground through coordinated counterattacks. The failure was complete and final. Panzerlehr had shot its bolt, spent its combat power on an attack that achieved temporary success but could not be exploited into decisive results. The division would remain in the Ardennes for another month, but never again conducted major offensive operations. The counterattack's failure marked the end of serious German attempts to cut the Bastogne corridor and re-isolate the garrison. The tactical reasons for German failure were multiple and interrelated. American artillery superiority allowed defensive fires that disrupted German formations before they could concentrate for decisive assault. Air superiority, which Germany had enjoyed through weather advantage during the offensive's opening days, now belonged to Americans flying in clear winter skies. Intelligence advantage meant Americans were not surprised and could prepare defenses and counterattacks. Perhaps most significantly, American tactical competence had improved through combat experience. The 35th Infantry Division that fought on December 29th was more tactically proficient than the same division on December 22nd. Soldiers had learned to coordinate infantry tank artillery teams under fire. They trusted their equipment and their leaders. They understood the tactical situation and believed they were winning. This combination of material advantage and improved tactical skill was decisive against German forces that retained individual competence but lacked the systemic advantages that modern warfare required. The strategic implications of the failed counterattack extended beyond the immediate Bastogne situation. For German forces throughout the Ardennes salient, The failure demonstrated that regaining offensive initiative was no longer possible. The western advance toward the Meuse River had stalled miles short of objectives. Bastogne had not fallen despite major efforts. American forces were concentrating in strengths that exceeded German ability to counter. Fuel shortages meant German armor could not maneuver freely, even when tactical situations suggested movement. The offensive that Hitler had launched, with expectations of splitting Allied armies and capturing Antwerp, had clearly failed. What remained was the difficult transition from failed offensive to defensive operations, a psychological and operational shift that German command structure managed poorly. Units that had attacked aggressively for 2 weeks now had to defend ground they had won while American forces attacked from multiple directions. American casualties in defending against the December 29th counterattack totaled approximately 300, significantly lower than German losses. This favorable casualty exchange reflected the advantages of defending from prepared positions against attacking forces that were exposed to artillery and air attack. The casualty differential was a reversal of the situation from December 16th through 22nd, when German forces advancing achieved favorable exchanges against retreating or defending Americans. The shift in casualty ratios indicated that tactical momentum had reversed, that American forces now held advantages they had lacked during the offensive's opening phase. For individual soldiers who died or were wounded on December the 29th, the strategic context provided no comfort, but their sacrifice occurred within operations that were succeeding rather than failing. As December 29th ended, the Bastogne corridor was secure against conventional military threat. German forces lacked the strength to cut it through direct attack. American forces controlled enough terrain on both flanks that German artillery could not effectively interdict supply traffic. The garrison that had been isolated for 7 days was now connected to Third Army with supply lines that functioned adequately if not perfectly. The immediate crisis had passed. What remained was the larger question of how to exploit the defensive success, how to transition from relief operations to offensive operations that would eliminate the German salient and restore the Allied front line to positions held before December 16th. That question would dominate operations for the next month, but answering it was possible only because the Bastogne corridor had been opened and held against German attempts to close it. January 2nd, 1945, Third Army Headquarters, Luxembourg City. Dwight Eisenhower and Omar Bradley sat across a table from George Patton, reviewing operational maps that documented 2 weeks of combat intensity, unlike anything the European theater had seen since Normandy. The statistics were sobering. Third Army had pivoted 90 degrees, moved 133,000 men, an average of 75 miles in winter conditions, and fought continuously for 14 days. The Bastogne corridor was secure. German offensive momentum had been stopped. The strategic crisis that threatened to split Allied armies had been contained, but the costs demanded assessment. 41,353 casualties, killed, wounded, missing. Equipment losses exceeded projections. Ammunition expenditure had consumed stockpiles intended for spring operations. The relief of Bastogne was a tactical and operational success, but success purchased at prices that raised questions about methods, leadership, and whether alternative approaches might have achieved similar results with fewer casualties. Eisenhower opened the discussion with characteristic directness. "George, you did what you promised. You turned Third Army north in 72 hours and relieved Bastogne. The question I need answered is whether it had to cost this much." The comment was not accusation, but genuine inquiry from a commander responsible for balancing operational success against casualty rates that had to be explained to political leaders in Washington and London. Patton's response was predictable, a defense of aggressive tactics grounded in his belief that speed and audacity saved more lives than they cost. Every day Bastogne remained surrounded risked the loss of 18,000 men, Patton argued. Every day we delayed gave Germans time to strengthen positions. Speed was expensive, but delay would have been more expensive. The debate that followed would echo through military academies for decades. Was Patton's aggressive approach the only way to achieve the relief? Or did his preference for attack over careful preparation increase casualties unnecessarily? The casualty statistics revealed patterns that supported both sides of the argument. Third Army's casualty rate during the Bastogne operation was 18% higher than other Allied armies conducting offensive operations in the same period. This suggested Patton's methods were indeed more costly in human terms. However, Third Army also achieved operational objectives faster than comparable forces. 4th Armored Division reached Bastogne in 7 days, despite having to fight 100 miles through winter conditions and prepare German defenses. British X-Corps, conducting a comparable movement operation in Holland during Operation Market Garden, had taken 5 days to advance 60 miles under better weather conditions. If speed had strategic value, if reaching Bastogne quickly prevented a larger disaster, then higher casualties might be justified as the price of success. The debate was ultimately philosophical. How much risk was acceptable in pursuit of operational objectives? Bradley, who had commanded Patton in Sicily and Normandy, understood his subordinates' strengths and limitations perhaps better than anyone in the chain of command. "You saved the campaign, George," Bradley acknowledged. "Without Third Army's intervention, we might have lost the entire First Army. But your methods worry me. You accept casualties that other commanders would find unacceptable. You push men beyond normal endurance. You take risks that violate Staff College principles." Patton's response revealed his fundamental philosophy. War is risk. The side that accepts more risk, that pushes harder, that refuses to be controlled by enemy action, wins. The Germans took risks in launching this offensive. We took greater risks in responding. We won because we were willing to accept the cost of bold action. The exchange captured tensions that had characterized Patton's career. A brilliant operational commander whose methods generated both spectacular successes and legitimate concerns about whether those methods were sustainable. The logistics statistics provided objective measures of what Third Army had achieved. In 14 days, Third Army had consumed 4 million gallons of fuel, moved 140,000 tons of supplies, fired 500,000 artillery rounds, and maintained combat operations across a front that stretched from the Saar River to Bastogne. The logistical throughput exceeded peacetime planning estimates by 80%, achieved through improvisation, rule-breaking, and accepting inefficiencies that peacetime standards would never tolerate. Quartermaster officers explained how they had sustained operations, diverting supplies from other armies, running trucks 22 hours daily, cannibalizing damaged vehicles to keep others operational, accepting ammunition shortages in secondary sectors to ensure primary sectors had sufficient supply. The logistics success was as impressive as the tactical operations it enabled, but it too raised questions about sustainability. Could these methods continue for months, or would the system eventually collapse from sustained overload? The tactical evolution that 4th Armored Division had undergone during the relief operation drew particular attention from Eisenhower's staff. The division's shift from frontal assaults to infiltration tactics, from separate armor and infantry operations to integrated combined arms teams, represented organizational learning at speeds that peacetime training could never achieve. The lessons were being documented in after-action reports that would influence doctrine across the European theater. But the learning had been purchased with casualties. The question was whether better initial training and doctrine could have provided these lessons without requiring soldiers to learn them through combat. Modern military theorists would debate whether combat inevitably required adaptation that training could never fully anticipate, or whether better preparation could reduce the casualties associated with tactical learning curves. German casualties in the Third Army sector during the same 14-day period were estimated at 55,000, exceeding American losses, but not by margins that suggested overwhelming American tactical superiority. The casualty exchange ratio of approximately 1.3 German casualties for each American casualty was less favorable than ratios achieved during the pursuit across France, when German forces in retreat suffered disproportionate losses. The narrower exchange ratio reflected that Third Army was attacking prepared positions defended by motivated troops, a tactical situation where defenders traditionally held advantages. That American forces achieved favorable exchanges at all testified to material advantages in artillery and air power that compensated for German tactical skill and defensive terrain advantages. The statistics suggested that replacing Patton with a more cautious commander might have reduced American casualties, but would also have reduced German casualties and potentially failed to achieve operational objectives within necessary time frames. The debate about alternative approaches focused on whether a different commander would have executed the relief operation differently. A more methodical commander might have taken an additional week to prepare, conducted more reconnaissance, coordinated more carefully before attacking. Such an approach would likely have reduced casualties, but might have arrived too late to save Bastogne's garrison. Alternatively, a more cautious approach might have failed entirely if German forces used the additional preparation time to strengthen defenses to the point where breakthrough was no longer possible. The counterfactual analysis was ultimately speculative, but it highlighted fundamental questions about military leadership. Should commanders optimize for casualty minimization or objective achievement, and how should they balance these competing priorities when they conflicted? Patton's personality emerged as a factor in assessing the operation's execution. His aggressive temperament, his belief in offensive action, his willingness to accept risks that other commanders avoided, had shaped every aspect of Third Army's operations. Staff officers described receiving orders they considered unrealistic, implementing them because Patton's force of will demanded compliance, and discovering that what seemed impossible was merely very difficult. The question was whether Patton's personality was an asset that enabled extraordinary achievements or a liability that increased casualties unnecessarily. Both perspectives had evidence supporting them. Patton's diary entries from the period, read aloud during the assessment, revealed a commander who agonized over casualties but believed that aggressive action saved lives in the long run by shortening the war. "Every day this war continues, more men die," Patton had written. "Speed kills soldiers, but delay kills more soldiers. I choose speed." As the assessment concluded, Eisenhower summarized the consensus view that would appear in official reports. Third Army's relief of Bastogne represents a significant operational achievement. General Patton demonstrated initiative, flexibility, and determination in executing one of the most difficult maneuvers of the Western European campaign. Casualties were significant but acceptable given the strategic importance of the objectives achieved. The carefully calibrated language acknowledged success while noting costs, praised leadership while implying that methods remained subject to debate. For Patton, the assessment was vindication. For his critics, it was recognition that results mattered more than style, even when style generated legitimate concerns. The Bastogne operation would cement Patton's reputation as one of America's most effective combat commanders, but it would not resolve debates about whether his methods represented the optimal approach to modern warfare. The broader strategic context provided the final measure of the operation's significance. The German Ardennes offensive had been stopped. Allied armies had not been split. The timetable for spring operations toward the Rhine remained viable despite the December crisis. American forces had demonstrated operational flexibility that surprised both allies and enemies, moving major formations and attacking effectively despite winter conditions that conventional wisdom suggested made such operations impossible. The Third Army pivot was studied by Soviet military observers, who noted that American logistics capabilities enabled rapid force concentration that Soviet forces could not match, despite their own impressive record of operational maneuver. The operation influenced post-war assessments of American military capability, challenging European assumptions that Americans were materially rich but operationally unsophisticated. Third Army had proven that American forces could match or exceed European armies in the operational art that had traditionally been considered a German and Russian specialty. March 1946, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The Command and General Staff College lecture hall was filled with officers who had returned from Europe and the Pacific to study the war they had just fought. The instructor, a colonel who had served on Patton's staff, stood before a map showing Third Army's December movement north. "What made it possible?" he asked the students. "How did Third Army achieve what staff estimates said required 2 weeks in just 72 hours? The question launched a discussion that would continue through decades of military education, analysis that peeled back layers of the Bastogne relief to identify the factors that had enabled success. The answers were multiple and interconnected, revealing that the operation's success resulted not from any single factor, but from the convergence of preparation, capability, leadership, and circumstance that military theorists would study as a case of how modern armies functioned at their theoretical maximum capacity. The contingency planning that Patton had ordered beginning December 12th provided the foundation for rapid execution. Staff officers who had participated in that planning described the process for post-war analysts. More than 50 officers had worked 5 days developing movement tables, route assignments, and logistics calculations for scenarios that officially did not exist. When orders came to execute Operation Copper, the most extensive of the contingency plans, staff simply pulled pre-written orders from safes and updated them with current unit positions. The time savings was enormous. Normal Corps movement planning required 14 days minimum. Third Army had compressed that to hours because the planning had been done in advance. The lesson seemed obvious in retrospect. Anticipate contingencies and prepare detailed plans for likely scenarios. But the lesson required a commander willing to violate doctrine by planning for operations outside assigned sectors, and a staff willing to invest substantial effort on plans that might never be used. Logistics preparation proved equally critical. Third Army had pre-positioned supply dumps with fuel and ammunition at locations that seemed irrelevant to the Saar offensive, but proved perfect for supporting operations north toward Bastogne. These dumps had been established based on contingency planning, placed where they could support movement in multiple directions, rather than optimized for the single operation Third Army was officially executing. When the pivot north began, units found fuel and ammunition already positioned along their routes of march, rather than having to wait for supplies to be moved from rear areas. The logistics foresight saved days of preparation time and enabled sustained operations immediately upon arrival at Bastogne. Post-war logistics officers would cite this as evidence that modern warfare required supply systems designed for flexibility rather than efficiency, accepting some waste in peacetime to enable rapid response when crises emerged. Weather played a decisive role that neither side could control, but both sought to exploit. German planners had studied historical weather patterns and timed their offensive to coincide with predicted poor flying weather that would ground Allied air forces. The gamble succeeded for 9 days, giving German forces freedom of movement that would have been impossible under clear skies. When weather cleared on December 23rd, Allied air superiority reasserted itself with devastating effect. Over 2,400 sorties were flown in support of Third Army operations between December 23rd and December 31st, destroying German armor, disrupting supply lines, and providing psychological assurance to ground forces that they were not fighting alone. The weather's impact was so significant that some analysts argued the relief operations' success depended more on meteorology than military skill. The truth was more nuanced. Both sides adapted to weather conditions, but American forces proved more effective at exploiting clear weather than Germans had been at exploiting poor weather. Intelligence advantages provided by ultra-decryption of German communications gave American commanders information that their German counterparts lacked. Intercepted German radio messages revealed force dispositions, attack plans, and logistics difficulties that allowed American forces to anticipate German moves and position forces accordingly. The intelligence advantage was not complete. Tactical surprise remained possible, and German forces achieved local successes throughout the campaign. But at operational level, American commanders knew German intentions days before German attacks materialized. This allowed them to concentrate forces at critical points rather than defending everywhere. The intelligence advantage was carefully concealed. Commanders could not act on ultra-information in ways that would reveal its source, forcing them to create plausible cover stories for decisions actually based on signals intelligence. The constraint added complexity to command, but provided information advantages that proved decisive in multiple engagements. Tactical flexibility at junior levels enabled adaptation that rigid command structures could not have achieved. 4th Armored Division's evolution from frontal assault tactics to infiltration and combined arms operations happened through junior officer initiative rather than top-down directive. Company commanders and platoon leaders who survived initial engagements shared lessons learned, and those lessons propagated through informal networks faster than official doctrine could incorporate them. The decentralized command philosophy that Patton encouraged, giving subordinates clear objectives and trusting them to determine methods, created space for tactical innovation that more centralized command structures would have suppressed. German forces, despite their reputation for tactical excellence, operated within command structures that limited junior officer initiative, creating irony where American forces traditionally considered less Tactically sophisticated, proved more adaptable than Germans whose military culture emphasized tactical flexibility. Artillery superiority provided the decisive advantage in most engagements. Third Army concentrated more artillery per mile of front than any comparable force in the European theater. Fire direction centers could mass fires from multiple battalions on targets within minutes of receiving fire missions. Forward observers with frontline units could call artillery support with confidence it would arrive quickly and accurately. The artillery advantage compensated for American tanks' inferiority to German Panthers and Tigers, allowing American forces to suppress German armor with high explosive shells when anti-tank guns could not penetrate armor. Artillery also disrupted German infantry attacks before they could close with American positions, converting German tactical skill into casualties that Germany could not replace. The artillery dominance was enabled by ammunition supply that German forces could not match. American industry produced shells in quantities that allowed expenditure rates German logistics could never sustain. Leadership at multiple levels contributed to success in ways that organizational charts could not capture. Patton's operational vision and willingness to accept risk enabled the rapid pivot north. Division commanders like Hugh Gaffey of 4th Armored translated operational concepts into tactical execution. Battalion commanders like Creighton Abrams led from the front, demonstrating courage that inspired soldiers to continue despite exhaustion and fear. Company commanders and platoon leaders made split-second decisions under fire that determined whether attacks succeeded or failed. The leadership was not uniformly excellent. Mistakes occurred at all levels, and some commanders proved inadequate under combat stress. But the overall quality of leadership was sufficient to sustain operations under conditions that would have broken less well-led forces. Post-war leadership studies would identify the Bastogne operation as demonstrating how leadership at multiple echelons must synchronize for complex operations to succeed. Material superiority provided the foundation that enabled everything else. American forces had more vehicles, more fuel, more ammunition, more replacement personnel than German forces could match. When equipment broke, replacements were available. When soldiers became casualties, new soldiers filled their positions. When supplies ran low, more supplies arrived. German forces lacked these luxuries. Their vehicles were immobilized for lack of fuel. Their casualties could not be replaced. Their ammunition was rationed to levels that limited tactical options. The material advantage was so overwhelming that some analysts argued it determined outcomes regardless of tactical or operational skill. This perspective ignored instances where German forces with material disadvantages achieved tactical success through superior skill, but it correctly identified that sustained operations required industrial and logistics capability that Germany lacked and America possessed in abundance. The synthesis of these factors created capability greater than any single element could explain. Contingency planning without logistics preparation would have failed. Logistics without tactical flexibility would have enabled deployment but not effective combat. Tactical skill without intelligence advantage would have faced unnecessary risks. Leadership without material resources would have inspired soldiers toward unachievable objectives. The Bastogne relief succeeded because multiple factors aligned. Preparation met opportunity, capability met requirement, leadership met challenge. Post-war analysis struggled to determine which factors were necessary and which were merely helpful, ultimately concluding that all were necessary and none alone was sufficient. The operation represented American military power functioning at high efficiency, revealing both the strengths that would characterize American military operations for decades and the resource requirements that sustaining such operations demanded. As the lecture at Fort Leavenworth concluded, students departed with notebooks full of observations about logistics, intelligence, tactics, and leadership. The lessons would influence how the U.S. Army organized, trained, and equipped itself for future conflicts. The emphasis on contingency planning would become doctrine. The focus on logistics flexibility would shape supply system design. The tactical innovations developed by 4th Armored would be incorporated into training programs. The Bastogne relief operation had demonstrated what was possible when modern military organizations functioned effectively, and military professionals would spend years extracting lessons that might help future forces achieve similar results. Whether those lessons could be applied in conflicts against different enemies in different terrain, under different political constraints, remained to be seen, but the Bastogne case study would remain relevant as long as armies needed to move forces quickly and fight effectively under adverse conditions. September 1991, Kuwait-Saudi Arabia border. A young captain in the U.S. 7th Corps studied a map showing his unit's positions along the Iraqi border and the routes they would take when ground operations began in Operation Desert Storm. His commander had just briefed a plan that seemed impossibly ambitious. 7th Corps would conduct a left hook maneuver, pivoting 90 degrees to attack Iraqi Republican Guard forces from an unexpected direction. The operation required moving thousands of vehicles through desert, maintaining supplies across hundreds of miles, and attacking immediately upon arrival against an enemy considered among the world's most experienced militaries. When junior officers expressed concern about the timeline, the Corps commander, himself a Vietnam veteran, responded with a historical reference. Third Army turned 90 degrees and relieved Bastogne in 72 hours during winter in Europe. We can do this in the desert with better equipment and better weather. The legacy of Patton's pivot had endured 46 years, shaping how American commanders thought about operational maneuver and what they believed was achievable under pressure. The Bastogne relief operation became the paradigm case study for operational agility in military education worldwide. At the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, every class since 1947 studied the operation in detail. Officers examined the contingency planning, logistics preparation, tactical adaptation, and leadership decisions that enabled success. They debated whether Patton's methods were optimal or whether alternative approaches might have achieved similar results with fewer casualties. The debates were never fully resolved because the counterfactuals were unknowable, but the discussions forced officers to think deeply about risk, speed, casualties, and the relationship between operational objectives and the methods used to achieve them. Similar discussions occurred at British Staff College, French École de Guerre, and German Führungsakademie, each institution drawing lessons shaped by national military culture and recent operational experience. The Soviet military studied the Bastogne operation with particular interest, seeing in it confirmation that American logistics capabilities enabled operational maneuver that Soviet forces could not match, despite their own impressive tradition of deep operations. Soviet analysts noted that Third Army moved 133,000 men, 75 miles in 72 hours, while maintaining combat effectiveness, a rate of strategic redeployment that Soviet forces had rarely achieved even under favorable conditions. The analysis influenced Soviet assessments of NATO capabilities during the Cold War, contributing to Soviet concerns about fighting a protracted conventional war against an alliance whose logistics could sustain operations at intensities Soviet planning could not match. Ironically, the operation that Americans studied for lessons about operational art influenced Soviet planning through demonstrating American material advantages that Soviet operational concepts could not overcome. The tactical innovations developed during the Bastogne relief influenced American armored doctrine for decades. The combined arms teams that 4th Armored created out of necessity became standard practice in armored operations. Infantry tank platoons operating as integrated units appeared in training manuals and organizational tables. The emphasis on decentralized execution, with junior officers empowered to make tactical decisions based on local conditions, became a defining characteristic of American military operations, the night infiltration. Tactics that allowed bypassing German strongpoints influenced training for operations in all conditions. These lessons were not unique to the Bastogne operation. Similar techniques had been developed by other units in other battles, but Bastogne's prominence in military history ensured that its tactical lessons reached broader audiences than lessons from less celebrated engagements. The operation's darker lessons about casualty rates and operational pace received less attention in official histories, but shaped internal debates about military doctrine. Patton's 41,000 casualties in 14 days represented a rate of loss that would have been unsustainable if extended across months. Modern armies learned from this that operational tempo had limits, that even highly motivated professional forces could not sustain maximum intensity operations indefinitely. The lesson influenced planning factors for force rotation, casualty replacement, and the duration of high-intensity operations that modern forces could sustain. These lessons were often learned through negative examples, operations that pushed forces too hard, sustained casualties that could not be replaced, or achieved tactical success at costs that undermined strategic objectives. Bastogne provided both positive and negative lessons, demonstrating what was possible while also revealing the costs that achieving the possible required. The human cost of the operation was commemorated in ways that shaped how Americans remembered World War II. The Luxembourg American Cemetery, where Patton was buried in 1945, held 5,076 white crosses, marking American soldiers killed in the European theater. Many had died in December 1944, during operations related to the Ardennes offensive and its aftermath. Annual ceremonies at Bastogne brought together veterans from the 101st Airborne and 4th Armored Division, aging soldiers who shared memories of cold, fear, courage, and comrades who had not survived. These commemorations kept the human dimension of the operation visible, ensuring that discussions of operational art and tactical innovation did not forget that military operations were ultimately about individual soldiers who risked and often lost their lives in service of objectives determined by distant commanders. The town of Bastogne itself became a memorial to the battle, its economy partially sustained by battlefield tourism that brought visitors from around the world to walk ground where desperate combat had occurred. The Mardassen Memorial, dedicated in 1950, overlooked the town and bore inscriptions naming American units that had participated in the defense and relief. Museums displayed artifacts from the battle, weapons, uniforms, personal items left behind by soldiers. Streets were named for American commanders and units. The commemoration was authentic but also commercialized, the battle's memory shaped by multiple generations' needs to find meaning in their ancestors' sacrifices. For residents of Bastogne, the battle was simultaneously a point of pride, a tourist attraction, and a reminder that their town had been a battlefield where thousands died. Modern military operations conducted after 1944 invoked the Bastogne precedent with varying appropriateness. The 1991 Gulf War left hook that 7th Corps executed was genuinely comparable. A large force conducted a significant operational maneuver and attacked effectively despite logistics challenges. The 2003 invasion of Iraq involved rapid force projection, but against an enemy that largely did not contest American movements, making comparisons to fighting through prepared German defenses questionable. Afghanistan operations involved different challenges of counterinsurgency rather than conventional maneuver warfare, making Bastogne analogies largely inapplicable. Military professionals learned to distinguish between genuine operational parallels and superficial invocations of Bastogne's legacy for rhetorical purposes. The operation remained relevant when discussing force movement, logistics under pressure, and attacking from unexpected directions, but it was not applicable to every situation where commanders wanted to invoke Patton's name to inspire aggressive action. The debate about whether Bastogne represented the best of American military capability or revealed dangerous tendencies toward accepting unnecessary casualties never fully resolved. Critics pointed to the 18% higher casualty rate compared to other Allied armies, arguing that more careful preparation and less aggressive tactics would have achieved similar results with fewer deaths. Defenders noted that Third Army accomplished its mission on a timeline that potentially saved the First Army from destruction, arguing that operational success justified tactical costs. The debate reflected broader tensions in American military culture between traditions emphasizing firepower and careful preparation versus traditions emphasizing maneuver and accepting risk for speed. Both traditions had historical successes to cite, and neither could claim exclusive validity. The Bastogne operation provided evidence for both perspectives, ensuring its relevance to debates that would continue as long as militaries had to balance competing priorities of casualty minimization and mission accomplishment. The counterfactual question of what would have happened if Patton had not relieved Bastogne intrigued historians, but ultimately remained speculative. Could the garrison have held longer without relief? Intelligence estimates suggested their ammunition would have become critical by December 28th, but air resupply might have extended that timeline. Would Germans have diverted more forces to reduce Bastogne if the corridor had not opened? Probably, but those forces would have come from offensives that were already stalling for other reasons. Would First Army have collapsed if German forces reached the Meuse River? Unlikely, given the reinforcements flowing to the theater from other sectors and strategic reserve. The most probable alternative was that Bastogne would have fallen after extended siege, requiring a more costly operation to recapture it, and that the German offensive would have achieved slightly deeper penetration before being contained. Whether these differences would have significantly altered the war's outcome was questionable. Germany lacked resources to exploit tactical success into strategic victory, regardless of specific Ardennes outcomes. As the 21st century approached, the Bastogne operation's legacy had crystallized into specific lessons that military professionals accepted, regardless of their views on Patton's methods. Contingency planning provided options that crisis response could not create. Logistics flexibility enabled operations that rigid supply systems could not sustain. Tactical adaptation under fire was essential to success against skilled opponents. Leadership at multiple levels must synchronize for complex operations to succeed. Material superiority provided advantages but did not guarantee victory without skill in employment. Speed had value, but not infinite value. There were circumstances where additional preparation would have saved more lives than rapid action. These lessons were not unique to Bastogne, but the operation's prominence ensured they reached audiences across military establishments worldwide. The final assessment, rendered by historians with access to documents from all sides and perspectives unclouded by immediate operational pressures, acknowledged both achievement and cost. Third Army's pivot north represented a significant operational accomplishment that demonstrated American forces' ability to conduct complex maneuvers under adverse conditions. The relief of Bastogne prevented a potentially larger disaster and demonstrated to German commanders that Allied operational flexibility exceeded their expectations. The operation was conducted at human costs that might have been reduced by different methods, but alternative methods might not have achieved objectives within necessary timeframes. The operation revealed both American military strengths in logistics, intelligence, and material resources, and weaknesses in initial tactical doctrine that required combat experience to correct. The legacy was complex, offering lessons about both capabilities to preserve and mistakes to avoid. 80 years after December 1944, the Bastogne relief operation remained relevant to military professionals for fundamental reasons. War continued to require moving forces quickly under adverse conditions. Logistics continued to determine whether operational concepts could be executed. Leadership continued to matter in ways that organizational charts could not capture. The specific circumstances of the Ardennes winter would never be perfectly replicated, but the underlying challenges of operational art, tactical adaptation, and balancing speed against preparation persisted across conflicts. As long as armies needed to turn, move, and fight under pressure, the story of how Third Army pivoted 90 degrees in 72 hours and relieved Bastogne would remain relevant, studied, and debated by soldiers seeking to understand what was possible at the edges of human and organizational capacity.